Hello everyone, and welcome back to the Horror Halloween. Now I know a lot of you use these videos to sleep, so before you drift off, I thought it would be a fun idea if everyone can leave a comment to let me know where you are listening from in the world. Also like and subscribe if you are enjoying the episodes. I never believed in the supernatural. Ghost stories, cursed places, and dark rituals were just silly tales people told to scare each other. But after what happened last summer, I'm not so sure anymore. It started when I was visiting my uncle's farm in the countryside. He lived near an old, abandoned church that locals called the Hollow Chapel. The building was barely standing, with its roof half caved in and ivy crawling up its crumbling stone walls. Uncle Pete warned me to stay away from it, saying it wasn't safe. But that only made me curious. One night, after everyone had gone to bed, I grabbed a flashlight and snuck out. The moon was bright, casting an eerie glow over the fields. The church was about a mile away, and as I walked closer, the air grew colder. By the time I reached the building, I could see my breath puffing out in white clouds. The front door was gone, leaving a gaping hole. I stepped inside, and the first thing I noticed was the smell, damp and rotting, like something had been left to decay for years. My flashlight beam swept over the dusty pews, the broken altar, and the stained glass windows that still held pieces of faded color. That's when I saw it, a symbol carved into the floor at the center of the church. It was a circle with strange shapes inside, none of which I recognized. The edges of the symbol were lined with old, melted candle wax, as if someone had performed a ritual here. I bent down to take a closer look, and that's when I heard it, a low hum, like the sound of a faraway machine. It didn't come from outside. It was coming from beneath me. I stood up quickly, my heart racing. My flashlight flickered and went out, plunging me into darkness. Panic set in, and I scrambled to turn it back on. When the beam finally came back, it landed on something that froze me in place. There were people in the church, at least 10 of them, standing in a circle around the symbol. They wore dark robes with hoods that covered their faces. None of them moved. They just stood there, silent and still, as if waiting for something. I didn't know what to do. My instinct screamed at me to run, but my legs felt like they were glued to the floor. Then, one of them turned their head toward me, and I saw their eyes. They glowed faintly, like embers in a dying fire. The hum grew louder, and the ground beneath my feet began to vibrate. One of the robed figures stepped forward, raising a hand toward me. I stumbled backward, dropping my flashlight, and tripped over a broken pew. As I scrambled to get up, I heard a voice, low and guttural, like it was coming from deep within the earth. It spoke in a language I didn't understand, but the tone was clear. It was angry. I bolted out of the church, running as fast as I could. The cold air burned my lungs, but I didn't stop until I reached my uncle's house. I burst through the door, gasping for breath. Uncle Pete was waiting in the living room, his face pale. "You went to the chapel, didn't you?" he asked, his voice shaking. I nodded, unable to speak. He grabbed my arm and pulled me into the kitchen, where he kept a shotgun. "Stay here," he said, loading the weapon. "If anyone comes to the house tonight, don't open the door." "Who are they?" I finally managed to ask. "They're not people," he said grimly. "Not anymore." Uncle Pete stayed up all night, keeping watch by the window. I didn't sleep at all. Every creak of the house made me jump. Every gust of wind sounded like footsteps. The next morning, Uncle Pete told me to pack my things. "You're going home," he said. I didn't argue. As we drove away, I looked back at the fields and saw the church in the distance. For a moment, I thought I saw figures standing near the entrance, watching us leave. I never went back to Uncle Pete's farm, and he eventually sold the place. I tried to forget what happened, convincing myself it was just my imagination. But sometimes, late at night, I hear that low hum in my dreams, and I remember those glowing eyes staring back at me. The Watchers of Black Hollow. When I was in college, I spent my summer break in a small, sleepy town called Black Hollow. My best friend, Mia, had grown up there, and her family owned a huge, old farmhouse at the edge of a dense forest. She invited me to stay with her for a few weeks, promising peace and quiet away from the chaos of city life. I thought it would be a good chance to relax. From the moment I arrived, something felt off. The town was eerily quiet. The streets were almost always empty, and the people I did see acted strangely, avoiding eye contact and speaking in hushed voices. Mia brushed it off, saying that Black Hollow had always been like that. "They're just old-fashioned," she said with a shrug. One night, about a week into my stay, Mia and I were sitting on her porch, talking and watching the fireflies. The forest loomed behind the house, dark and impenetrable. Out of nowhere, Mia turned to me and said, "Have you heard the stories about the Watchers?" I shook my head, intrigued. "It's just a local legend," she said, her voice lowering as if she didn't want anyone else to hear. "They say there's a group of people, some kind of cult, that lives in the forest. They only come out at night, and they watch. They watch people in their homes, in their beds. No one knows what they want, but if you see them watching you," she paused, glancing nervously toward the trees, "you're never the same." I laughed nervously. "That's creepy, but it's just a story, right?" Mia didn't answer. Instead, she changed the subject, but the unease lingered. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about the Watchers, imagining shadowy figures lurking outside the window. Around midnight, I got up to get a glass of water. As I passed by the living room, I glanced out the window and froze. There was someone standing at the edge of the forest. I couldn't see their face, but I could tell they were staring directly at the house. They were tall, with their head tilted slightly to the side, like they were studying something. My heart pounded in my chest. I wanted to believe it was just a trick of the shadows, but something in my gut told me it wasn't. I backed away from the window and hurried to Mia's room, shaking her awake. "There's someone outside," I whispered. She sat up, her eyes wide. "Where?" "At the edge of the forest." Mia didn't say anything. She just grabbed my arm and pulled me into her parents' room. They were already awake, standing by the window with worried expressions. Her dad had a shotgun in his hands. "They're here," he said grimly. "What's going on?" I asked, panic rising in my voice. Mia's mom put a hand on my shoulder. "Stay inside. No matter what you hear, don't go outside." I didn't understand what was happening, but the fear in her eyes was enough to keep me quiet. We sat together in the dark, listening. At first, there was nothing but the sound of crickets outside. Then, I heard it, a faint rustling, like leaves being disturbed. It was followed by a low, rhythmic chant that sent shivers down my spine. "They're calling," Mia's dad muttered, gripping the shotgun tighter. The chanting grew louder, and soon, I could see flickering lights in the forest, torches. Shadows moved between the trees, dozens of them, all converging on the house. My stomach turned as the realization hit me. They were coming for us. Suddenly, the chanting stopped. The silence was deafening. Then, a voice, low and guttural, echoed from the forest. "Bring her to us." I felt every hair on my body stand on end. "Who are they talking about?" I whispered. No one answered, but Mia's mom pulled me closer, as if shielding me. The voice came again, louder this time. "Bring her to us or face the consequence." Mia's dad stepped onto the porch, his shotgun raised. "Leave us alone," he shouted into the night. The response was immediate. The torches flared brighter, and the chanting resumed, faster and more frenzied. The shadows moved closer, stepping into the moonlight. My breath caught in my throat. They were wearing long, tattered robes, their faces hidden by dark hoods. But their eyes glowed like hot coals, piercing through the darkness. Mia's dad fired a warning shot into the air, but it didn't faze them. They kept coming, their chanting growing louder and more chaotic. The ground seemed to tremble beneath us. "We need to leave," Mia's mom said, her voice trembling. "Now." We ran to the car, but as soon as we got outside, the chanting stopped again. The sudden silence was more terrifying than the noise. I looked around, and my blood ran cold. The figures were gone. The forest was still, as if nothing had happened. "Get in the car," Mia's dad ordered. As we drove away, I kept looking out the window, half expecting to see the Watchers chasing us. But the forest remained quiet, almost peaceful. I thought we were safe until I noticed something in the rearview mirror. A single figure stood in the middle of the road, watching us drive away. Its glowing eyes were fixed on me. We never went back to Black Hollow. Mia's family moved out of the farmhouse a few weeks later, leaving everything behind. They wouldn't talk about what happened, and neither would I. But sometimes, late at night, I feel like I'm being watched. I'll glance out the window, half expecting to see those glowing eyes staring back at me. So far, I haven't, but I can't shake the feeling that they're still out there, waiting. It all began when my older brother, Ryan, went missing. He was always a bit of a wanderer, taking off for days at a time to explore nearby forests or abandoned buildings. This time, though, he didn't come back. After 3 days without a word, my parents called the police, but they didn't seem too concerned. "He's a teenager," they said. "He'll turn up." But I knew something was wrong. Ryan wasn't just my brother. He was my best friend. He never went anywhere without telling me. So, I decided to find him myself. The last time anyone saw him was near a place called Raven's Hill. It was an old, crumbling estate on the outskirts of town, surrounded by dense woods. The locals said it was cursed, but no one could agree on why. Some said the original owner went mad and killed his family. Others claimed a cult had taken over the property years ago and used it for dark rituals. Either way, people avoided it like the plague. I borrowed my dad's flashlight and snuck out one night, determined to search Raven's Hill. The path leading there was overgrown and eerie, with gnarled trees casting long shadows under the moonlight. As I got closer, the air grew colder and a strange smell, like burning wood mixed with something metallic, wafted through the trees. When I reached the estate, I stopped in my tracks. The building was a massive, rotting husk, with ivy crawling up its walls and broken windows staring out like empty eyes. But what really caught my attention was the light. Flickering orange light spilled out from the windows, casting strange, dancing shadows on the ground. Someone was inside. I crept closer, staying low and keeping to the shadows. As I approached, I could hear voices, low and rhythmic, like chanting. My heart pounded as I peered through one of the broken windows. Inside, a group of people in dark robes stood in a circle around a massive stone altar. The altar was covered in strange carvings and splattered with something dark and wet. In the middle of the circle was a tall figure wearing a mask shaped like a bird's skull. They held a staff topped with a flickering flame, and their voice boomed as they led the chant. At first, I didn't understand what they were saying. The words were guttural and strange, like a language I'd never heard before. But as I watched, the words began to make sense, as if they were burrowing into my mind. By the blood of the chosen, we summoned the eternal shadow, the leader intoned. My stomach churned as I realized what was on the altar. It was a body, limp and lifeless, with its hands and feet bound. I couldn't see the face, but my mind screamed that it could be Ryan. I was about to run in and stop them when something grabbed my shoulder. I nearly screamed, but a hand clamped over my mouth. I turned to see an old man with wild, unkempt hair and terrified eyes. He shook his head, silently motioning for me to follow him. Reluctantly, I backed away from the window and followed the man into the trees. When we were far enough from the house, he finally spoke. "You shouldn't be here," he whispered. "They'll see you." "Who are they?" I asked, my voice shaking. "The Keepers of the Shadow," he said. "Cult. They've been here for decades, performing their rituals and sacrificing anyone they can get their hands on. If they've taken your brother," he trailed off, his expression grim. I felt a surge of anger and fear. "We have to stop them. My brother might still be alive." The man shook his head. "You don't understand. They're not just people. They've made deals with something that isn't human. That's how they've survived this long." "I don't care," I said, my voice trembling. "I'm not leaving without Ryan." The man sighed and reluctantly agreed to help me. He said his name was Amos and that he'd been trying to stop the cult for years, but he'd never been able to get close enough without being caught. Together, we came up with a plan. Amos would create a distraction while I searched the house for Ryan. We waited until the chanting grew louder, signaling the climax of their ritual. Amos crept around to the other side of the house and started banging on the walls and shouting. The cultists froze, their heads snapping toward the noise. The leader barked an order, and several robed figures hurried outside to investigate. I took my chance and slipped through a broken side door. The interior was even more horrifying than I'd imagined. The walls were covered in strange symbols painted in what looked like blood, and the air was thick with the stench of decay. I crept through the halls, my flashlight barely cutting through the darkness. The chanting had resumed, but it sounded fainter now, as if coming from deeper within the house. I followed the sound, my heart racing with every step. Finally, I found a door leading to the basement. I hesitated for a moment, then steeled myself and descended the creaking wooden stairs. The basement was a nightmare. The walls were lined with shelves holding jars filled with unidentifiable substances, and the floor was sticky with something I didn't want to think about. In the center of the room was another altar, smaller than the one upstairs but just as grotesque, and chained to the wall nearby was Ryan. He was alive, but barely. His face was pale, and his wrists were raw from struggling against the chains. "Ryan," I whispered, running to him. His eyes fluttered open, and a weak smile crossed his face. "You shouldn't have come," he murmured. I fumbled with the chains, trying to free him, but they wouldn't budge. "I'm getting you out of here," I promised. Before I could figure out how, footsteps echoed from the stairs. The cultists had returned. Panic surged through me as I looked around for a weapon. My eyes landed on a rusty metal rod leaning against the wall. I grabbed it and stood in front of Ryan, my hands shaking. The robed figures filed into the room, their glowing eyes fixed on us. The leader stepped forward, their bird-like mask glinting in the dim light. "You should not have interfered," they said, their voice cold and inhuman. They raised their staff, and the flickering flame atop it roared to life, casting monstrous shadows on the walls. The air grew heavy, and I felt an overwhelming sense of dread, as if something ancient and malevolent was watching us. Before the leader could strike, a deafening crash came from upstairs. Amos had set fire to the main floor, and the flames were spreading quickly. The cultist hesitated, glancing toward the stairs. Seizing the moment, I swung the metal rod at the leader, knocking the staff from their hands. The flames sputtered out, and the oppressive atmosphere lifted slightly. I turned back to Ryan and yanked on the chains with all my strength. They finally gave way, and he slumped into my arms. "Let's go," I shouted, half carrying him toward the stairs. The cultists didn't follow. Instead, they stood in a circle around the fallen staff, chanting frantically. The leader picked it up and thrust it into the air, and I felt a deep rumble beneath my feet. We barely made it out of the house before it collapsed in on itself, consumed by the fire. I dragged Ryan into the woods, where Amos was waiting for us. Together, we got him to safety. The next morning, the police searched the site but found no evidence of the cult. The house was reduced to ashes, and the basement was caved in. Ryan and I tried to explain what had happened, but no one believed us. They chalked it up to trauma and overactive imaginations. But I know what I saw. The cult may be gone, but sometimes, when I close my eyes, I see the glowing eyes of the watchers and hear their chants echoing in the darkness. I don't know what they were trying to summon that night, but I fear that whatever it was, it's still out there, waiting. My name is Rachel, and this is the story of how my friends and I stumbled into something we were never meant to see. I still can't sleep without the lights on, and I doubt I'll ever feel safe again. It started during our summer trip to Crimson Lake. My friends, Mark, Lila, and I, were all looking for a quiet getaway before heading off to college. Crimson Lake was supposed to be perfect, a remote, peaceful spot surrounded by dense forest. There were rumors of strange happenings in the area, but we brushed them off as silly campfire stories. We just wanted a place to relax and disconnect. We rented a small cabin on the edge of the lake, miles away from the nearest town. The first couple of days were idyllic. We swam in the cool water, hiked through the woods, and stayed up late telling ghost stories around the campfire. But on the third night, everything changed. It started with the drumming. We were sitting by the fire when we heard it, a steady, rhythmic beat echoing through the trees. It was faint at first, like the distant tapping of rain, but it grew louder and more deliberate. The sound seemed to come from deep within the forest. "What's that?" Lila asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Probably just some hunters," Mark said, though he didn't sound convinced. I frowned. Hunters don't drum. Curiosity got the better of us, and we decided to investigate. Armed with flashlights and a sense of adventure, we ventured into the woods. The drumming grew louder as we walked, accompanied by an eerie hum that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand on end. After about 20 minutes, we reached a clearing. In the center was a massive bonfire, its flames crackling and casting flickering shadows on the surrounding trees. Around the fire stood a group of people wearing crimson robes. Their faces were hidden by hoods, but I could feel their presence, an oppressive weight that made it hard to breathe. "What the hell is this?" Mark whispered. Before anyone could answer, one of the robed figures stepped forward, holding a large wooden staff. The drumming stopped, and the hum grew louder, as if the forest itself was alive and listening. The figure raised the staff and began to chant in a guttural, otherworldly language. I wanted to run, but I couldn't look away. The air felt thick, charged with an energy I couldn't explain. Then, from the shadows, two more figures emerged, dragging something behind them. My stomach turned when I realized it was a person, a man, bound and gagged, struggling against his captors. "We need to go," Lila whispered, her voice trembling. "Now." But it was too late. One of the robed figures turned toward us, and I saw the glint of glowing eyes beneath their hood. They raised a hand, pointing directly at us. Panic set in, and we bolted. The forest seemed darker, the trees more twisted, as we ran blindly through the undergrowth. The drumming resumed, louder and faster, like a heartbeat chasing us through the night. I don't know how long we ran, but when we finally stopped, we were hopelessly lost. The cabin was nowhere in sight, and the only sound was our ragged breathing. "What was that?" Lila gasped, clutching her knees. "What were they doing to that guy?" "I don't know," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "But we need to find our way back before they—" A low, guttural growl cut me off. We froze, shining our flashlights into the darkness. The beam landed on a figure standing between the trees. It wasn't one of the cultists. It was something else. Its body was twisted and elongated, its limbs too long for its frame. Its skin was pale and stretched tight over its bones, and its eyes glowed faintly, like embers in a dying fire. It stared at us for a moment, then opened its mouth, revealing rows of jagged teeth. "Run." The word wasn't spoken. It was in my head, loud and clear, as if the creature was inside my mind. Without hesitation, we turned and ran again, the sound of snapping branches and heavy footsteps following close behind. We eventually stumbled back onto the road leading to the cabin. By some miracle, we made it inside and locked the doors behind us. But we weren't safe. The drumming was still there, faint but persistent, and the oppressive feeling of being watched never left. Mark grabbed a kitchen knife, his hands shaking. "We need to call for help. There's no signal out here," I said, holding up my phone. "What do we do then?" Lila asked, her voice cracking. Before anyone could answer, the lights flickered and went out, plunging the cabin into darkness. The drumming grew louder, now accompanied by whispers that seemed to come from everywhere at once. Then came the knock, a single, deliberate knock at the door. We huddled together, too terrified to move. The knock came again, louder this time. "Open the door," a voice called. It was soft and melodic, almost hypnotic. "We just want to talk." "Go away," Mark shouted, his voice breaking. The voice laughed, a cold, hollow sound that sent shivers down my spine. "You've seen too much. You can't leave." The drumming stopped abruptly, replaced by a deafening silence. Then the windows shattered, and the door burst open. I don't remember much after that. Flashes of crimson robes, glowing eyes, and chanting voices fill my nightmares, but the details are hazy. When I woke up, it was morning, and I was lying on the shore of the lake. Lila and Mark were there too, both unconscious but alive. We never spoke about what happened that night. We left Crimson Lake and never went back. Sometimes, though, I hear drumming in my dreams, and when I wake up, I can't shake the feeling that someone is watching me. It started when I got a summer job as a groundskeeper at Blackwood Church. It was an old, crumbling building perched on a hill overlooking the town, its spires stabbing into the gray sky like a warning. I didn't know much about it except that it had been abandoned for decades. The congregation disbanded in the 1960s after a fire gutted the sanctuary, and no one had bothered to rebuild it. My job was simple: clear the overgrown cemetery, board up broken windows, and make sure no vandals or squatters were sneaking in. It wasn't glamorous, but it paid well, and I figured it would be easy money. I was wrong. From the moment I arrived, something felt off. The air around the church was heavy, and the shadows seemed too dark, even in broad daylight. The cemetery was a tangled mess of weeds and toppled headstones, but it wasn't the decay that bothered me. It was the silence. No birds, no insects, nothing. Just an eerie, oppressive stillness. The first few days passed uneventfully. I spent my time clearing brush and patching up broken windows, but every so often, I'd catch glimpses of movement out of the corner of my eye, shadows darting between the headstones or shifting in the dim interior of the church. I told myself it was just my imagination, but the unease gnawed at me. Then I found the hatch. It was hidden beneath a pile of rubble in the church's basement. I wasn't even supposed to be down there, but curiosity got the better of me. The hatch was made of heavy iron, rusted with age, and covered in strange symbols that looked hand-carved. A thick chain secured it shut, and the air around it felt colder, almost like it was seeping through the metal. I should have left it alone. Every instinct told me to walk away, but I didn't. I spent the rest of the day wondering what could be beneath it. Was it a crypt? A storage cellar? Something else? By the time I left for the night, the mystery was all I could think about. That night, I dreamed of whispers. They were faint at first, like wind rustling through leaves, but they grew louder, forming words I couldn't understand. The voices overlapped, speaking in a rhythm that felt almost like chanting. When I woke up, I was drenched in sweat, and the sound of the whispers lingered in my ears. The next day, I brought a crowbar to work. Breaking the chain felt wrong, but my curiosity overpowered my fear. The metal groaned and gave way after a few minutes of prying, and the hatch creaked open, revealing a narrow stone staircase spiraling downward. A foul smell wafted up from the darkness, damp earth and something metallic, like blood. I hesitated, but the pull to explore was overwhelming. I grabbed my flashlight and descended. The staircase seemed to go on forever, the air growing colder and more oppressive with each step. At the bottom, I found myself in a cavernous chamber. The walls were covered in the same strange symbols as the hatch, glowing faintly in the dim light. In the center of the room was a massive stone altar, surrounded by blackened candles that looked like they hadn't been lit in decades. And then there were the bones, piles of them, scattered around the room, animal and human, their surfaces scratched and worn. My stomach churned, and I stumbled back, nearly dropping my flashlight. That's when I heard it, the whispers. At first, they were faint, just like in my dream, but they grew louder, more insistent, coming from all directions. My flashlight flickered, and I felt a cold breath on the back of my neck. I spun around, but there was no one there. I wanted to run, but my legs felt rooted to the ground. The whispers grew louder, merging into a cacophony of voices that filled the chamber. Then, from the shadows, figures began to emerge. They were cloaked in tattered robes, their faces hidden beneath deep hoods. Their movements were slow and deliberate, as if they were gliding rather than walking. They formed a circle around the altar, and one of them stepped forward, holding a jagged dagger. I was paralyzed with fear as the figure began to chant, their voice low and guttural. The symbols on the walls pulsed with light, and the air grew thick with the stench of decay. The other figures joined in the chant, their voices harmonizing in a way that made my skin crawl. I realized too late that I had stumbled into something ancient and malevolent, a ritual that had been waiting to be completed. The lead figure raised the dagger, and the whispers grew deafening. The symbols on the walls flared with blinding light, and I felt a searing pain in my chest, as if something was being ripped from me. I screamed, but the sound was swallowed by the chant. Then, just as suddenly as it started, everything stopped. The light faded, the chanting ceased, and the robed figures turned toward me in unison. "You've seen too much," the lead figure said, their voice a chilling blend of male and female tones. "You are marked." Before I could react, the chamber began to collapse. The walls cracked and crumbled, and the floor gave way beneath me. I scrambled back up the staircase, barely making it out before the entire structure caved in. When I emerged into the daylight, the church looked the same as before, silent and decaying, as if nothing had happened. But I knew better. The whispers didn't stop. I could still hear them, faint but persistent, following me everywhere I went. I quit the job that day and never went back, but the events of that summer haunt me. I've tried to tell myself it wasn't real, that it was just my imagination, but the whispers won't let me forget. Sometimes, late at night, I hear them louder than ever. And when I look out my window, I see shadows moving in the dark. They're waiting for me, biding their time, because I am marked, and they will come for me. Growing up in Ashford Hollow, a sleepy little town surrounded by dense woods, I'd always heard the stories. People whispered about the Ashford Shadow Society, a secret cult that supposedly worshipped something ancient and evil. Most of us dismissed it as folklore, a tale parents told their kids to keep them from wandering into the woods alone. But the summer I turned 16, I learned the truth, and I wish I hadn't. It started with the disappearance of Emma Caldwell. She was a bright, friendly girl in my grade, someone everyone liked. She vanished without a trace during the 4th of July festival. One moment she was laughing with her friends near the fireworks display. The next, she was gone. No one saw her leave, and no one could explain what happened. The town was in an uproar. Search parties combed the woods, and the sheriff questioned everyone, but there were no leads. People started to lock their doors at night, and the old stories about the Shadow Society began to resurface. I didn't think much of it at first. Like most teenagers, I was too wrapped up in my own world to worry about town gossip. But then I found the journal. It was lying in the woods near the edge of town, half buried under leaves and dirt. The leather cover was worn and scratched, and the pages were filled with messy handwriting. It didn't take long to realize it was Emma's. The entries were ordinary at first, notes about school, friends, and crushes. But as I flipped through the pages, the tone changed. Emma wrote about strange things she'd seen in the woods. Figures in dark robes, chanting voices, and flickering lights that seemed to move on their own. She mentioned feeling like she was being watched and hearing whispers that called her name. Her last entry sent a chill down my spine. "They want me. I don't know why, but they're coming for me. I saw them last night. Robed figures standing at the edge of my yard. I can still hear their whispers. I have to know what they want. If anyone finds this, please understand. I didn't run away. They took me." I should have taken the journal straight to the sheriff, but something stopped me. Maybe it was morbid curiosity, or maybe it was the sense that I was holding a piece of a puzzle no one else could solve. Either way, I decided to investigate. That night, I snuck out and headed into the woods with a flashlight and a pocket knife, my only defense against whatever might be out there. The air was heavy, and the forest seemed unnaturally quiet. No birds, no insects, just the sound of my footsteps crunching on the leaves. I didn't have a plan, just a vague idea of retracing Emma's steps. As I wandered deeper into the woods, I began to notice strange things. Trees with symbols carved into their bark, small stone altars covered in dried blood, and patches of ground where the grass seemed to wither and die. Then I heard the chanting. It was faint at first, carried on the wind, but it grew louder as I moved toward it. The words were in a language I didn't recognize, guttural and rhythmic, like the growl of some ancient beast. My heart pounded as I followed the sound, each step taking me closer to something I wasn't sure I wanted to find. I emerged into a clearing, and what I saw froze me in place. A group of robed figures stood in a circle around a massive stone slab, their faces hidden beneath dark hoods. The slab was covered in strange markings, glowing faintly in the moonlight. At the center of the circle was Emma, bound and gagged, her eyes wide with terror. One of the figures raised a hand, and the chanting stopped. They spoke in a voice that was deep and resonant, reverberating through the clearing. "She has been chosen," they said. "The offering will strengthen the bond." The other figures murmured in agreement, and the leader stepped forward, holding a curved dagger. I couldn't just stand there. I had to do something. Adrenaline took over, and I charged into the clearing, yelling at the top of my lungs. The robed figures turned toward me, their movements eerily slow and deliberate. For a moment, I thought they might run, but then the leader raised the dagger, and the chanting resumed, louder and more frantic. "Leave now," the leader said, their voice cutting through the noise. "This does not concern you. Let her go," I shouted, brandishing my pocket knife. It felt pathetic compared to the weapon they held, but it was all I had. The leader tilted their head, as if considering my demand. Then they lowered the dagger and gestured to the others. Two of the robed figures began to move toward me, their footsteps silent despite the crunch of leaves beneath them. Panic set in, and I turned to run. But the air around me seemed to thicken, like I was moving through water. The chanting grew louder, and I felt a strange pull, as if invisible hands were dragging me back toward the circle. Just when I thought I was done for, a loud crack echoed through the clearing. One of the robed figures collapsed, a bullet hole in their chest. Another crack followed, and the second figure fell. The sheriff burst into the clearing, his rifle raised. "Get away from the kid," he shouted. The cultists scattered, their movements unnaturally fast. The leader lingered for a moment, staring at me with eyes that glowed faintly beneath their hood, before disappearing into the shadows. The sheriff ran to Emma, cutting her bindings and helping her to her feet. "You okay, kid?" he asked. She nodded, tears streaming down her face. "Let's get out of here," he said, glancing at me. "And you're coming with us. You've got some explaining to do." Back in town, Emma and I told the sheriff everything about the journal, the symbols in the woods, and the ritual. He listened quietly, his face grim, and then handed us both cups of coffee to calm our nerves. "You kids have no idea what you've stumbled into," he said finally. "The Shadow Society isn't just a myth. They've been around for centuries, worshipping something. No one knows what it is, but it's old and dangerous, and they don't like witnesses. What do we do?" I asked, my voice shaking. "Lay low," he said. "I'll do what I can to keep you safe, but these people don't give up easily. If they've marked you, they'll come back." He was right. In the weeks that followed, strange things started happening. I'd find symbols drawn on my windows in ash, or dead birds on my doorstep. Emma had similar experiences, and neither of us could shake the feeling of being watched. The sheriff tried to protect us, but there was only so much he could do. One night, his house burned down, and he disappeared. Some said he left town, but Emma and I knew better. We eventually moved away, trying to put as much distance as we could between ourselves and Ashford Hollow. But no matter where I go, the memories linger. Sometimes, late at night, I still hear the chanting, faint and distant, like a shadow creeping closer. And I know they're still out there, waiting for the right moment to finish what they started. When my uncle died, I inherited his house in Blackthorn Valley. It wasn't much to look at, a sagging Victorian nestled in a remote valley surrounded by dense, ancient woods. My parents warned me against moving there, citing the town's strange reputation, but I saw it as an escape. I was in my late 20s, stuck in a dead-end job, and desperate for a fresh start. The house, with all its quirks and mysteries, seemed like a perfect place to reset my life. I should have listened to my parents. The house itself was eerie but beautiful, with its creaking floorboards and tall windows that let in just enough light to make the shadows dance. The locals were polite but distant, offering me wary smiles when I introduced myself. It was clear they didn't trust outsiders, and I quickly learned to keep to myself. Then there was the field. Behind the house stretched a massive clearing surrounded by the forest. The grass there grew wild and tall, but no matter how often I mowed it, it always seemed to grow back overnight. The locals called it the harvest ground and avoided it at all costs. "Best leave it alone," Mrs. Grady, the elderly woman from the general store, told me one day. Nothing good comes from meddling with that field. When I pressed her for details, she clammed up, her face pale as a ghost. The first real sign of trouble came about a week after I moved in. I was sitting on the porch, sipping tea, when I noticed something glinting in the middle of the field. Curious, I grabbed my boots and trudged through the tall grass to investigate. It was a scarecrow, though it hadn't been there the day before. Its body was made of twisted branches and old burlap, with a crude sack for a head. But what unsettled me most were the eyes, two smooth, polished stones that seemed to glimmer in the fading light. I chalked it up to a prank, maybe from some bored teenagers in the valley, and didn't think much of it. But that night, I had a dream. Or maybe it was something more. I was standing in the field, surrounded by figures in long, tattered robes. They chanted in low, guttural voices, their words blending with the rustling of the wind. At the center of their circle was the scarecrow, its stone eyes glowing faintly. One of the figures turned to me, lifting its hood to reveal a face that was wrong. Twisted, pale, with hollow eyes that seemed to pierce through me. "You shouldn't have come here," it said, its voice like gravel. I woke up drenched in sweat, my heart pounding. The dream felt too vivid, too real. Shaking it off, I went about my day, determined to ignore the strange feeling that had settled over me. But the dreams continued, each one more vivid than the last. The figures in the robes grew closer, their chanting louder. The scarecrow seemed to come alive, its arms reaching out toward me, and always the warning, "You shouldn't have come here." During the day, I started noticing other oddities. The field always seemed alive, somehow. The grass swayed even when there was no wind, and the air around it felt charged, like the moments before a storm. I began finding strange symbols carved into the trees at the edge of the forest. Circles, spirals, and jagged lines that looked like runes. Then I found the bones. They were scattered at the edge of the field, half buried in the dirt. At first, I thought they were animal bones, deer, maybe, but as I unearthed them, I realized they were too large, too human. My stomach churned, and I stumbled back, the images of the robed figures flashing in my mind. I went to the local sheriff, a gruff man named Halloran, and told him about the bones. He listened quietly, his expression unreadable, then leaned forward and said, "Leave it alone." "What do you mean, leave it alone?" I demanded. "There are human bones in my field." Sheriff Halloran sighed, rubbing his temples. "You're new here, so I'll give you some advice. That field's been there longer than this town, longer than any of us. It's not ours to meddle with. Do yourself a favor. Pack up and leave." I left his office furious and confused, but his words stuck with me. What did he mean it wasn't ours? And why was everyone so afraid of that field? That night, the dreams escalated. This time, I wasn't just watching the ritual, I was part of it. I stood among the robed figures, chanting words I didn't understand, my voice blending with theirs. The scarecrow was gone, replaced by a figure bound to the altar in the center of the circle. When I woke up, my hands were covered in dirt. Terrified, I decided I couldn't stay in Blackthorn Valley. I packed a bag and prepared to leave the next morning, but as I stepped outside, I froze. The scarecrow was standing at the edge of the field, its glowing eyes fixed on me. It wasn't alone. A group of townsfolk stood behind it, their faces blank and emotionless. Sheriff Halloran was among them, his rifle slung over his shoulder. Mrs. Grady was there too, clutching a lantern. They didn't say a word, just stood there, watching. "What do you want?" I shouted, my voice shaking. Halloran stepped forward. "You've been chosen," he said simply. "Chosen for what?" "The harvest." Before I could respond, the ground beneath my feet began to tremble. The field seemed to come alive, the grass twisting and writhing like snakes. The scarecrow raised its arms, and a deafening roar filled the air. A sound that was neither human nor animal, but something far older and more powerful. I turned and ran, but the ground seemed to shift beneath me, dragging me back toward the field. The air grew thick, making it hard to breathe, and the chanting from my dreams filled my ears. I tripped and fell, the grass wrapping around my ankles like fingers. The last thing I saw before the world went black was the scarecrow standing over me, its glowing eyes boring into my soul. When I woke up, I was in my house, lying on the floor. The field was quiet, the scarecrow gone. At first, I thought it had all been a nightmare, but then I noticed the marks on my wrists, bruises, like I'd been bound. My clothes were filthy, and my hands were stained with dirt. I left Blackthorn Valley that day, never looking back. But even now, miles away, I can still hear the chanting in my dreams. The symbols from the trees appear in the corners of my vision, and the smell of damp earth clings to me, no matter how much I wash. I don't know what they did to me that night, but I know one thing for certain. I'll never be free of Blackthorn Valley, because the harvest never ends. It started with a road trip. My best friend, Tyler, and I were on our way back from a music festival, taking back roads to avoid the holiday traffic. The drive was supposed to be relaxing, just two friends, good tunes, and endless stretches of open highway. But somewhere along the way, the GPS glitched, and we ended up lost in the middle of nowhere. The sun was setting, casting long shadows over the dense pine forest that lined the road. The deeper we drove, the more uneasy I felt. The road narrowed, and the trees seemed to close in around us. The air grew colder, heavier. Maybe we should turn back, I suggested, my voice trembling slightly. Tyler shook his head. We're fine. The GPS will figure itself out. Worst case, we'll ask for directions at the next town. But the next town wasn't what we expected. We came across a small, isolated village tucked into the woods. The houses were old and weathered, their roofs sagging under the weight of time. There were no cars, no streetlights, just rows of lanterns hanging from wooden posts, their flickering light casting eerie shadows on the dirt road. It's like stepping back in time, Tyler muttered, pulling the car to a stop in front of what looked like a general store. We got out and approached the store, hoping to find someone who could point us in the right direction. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of dried herbs and old wood. An elderly man stood behind the counter, his eyes sharp and watchful. Evening, Tyler said. We're a bit lost. Can you tell us how to get back to the main highway? The man didn't answer right away. Instead, he glanced out the window, as if checking for something or someone. Then he leaned in close, his voice low. You boys need to leave. Now. Tyler frowned. We just need directions. Listen to me. The man interrupted, his tone urgent. Get back in your car and drive. Don't stop for anything. And whatever you do, don't follow the lanterns. We left the store, shaken but still unsure what to make of the old man's warning. The village felt wrong, though. Every house we passed had curtains drawn tight, and I swore I saw eyes watching us from the shadows. As we reached the edge of town, the lanterns lining the road grew brighter, their golden light cutting through the encroaching darkness. Against my better judgment, I glanced back at the village and saw something that made my blood run cold. Figures in dark robes were gathering in the center of town, their faces hidden beneath hoods. Each one held a lantern, its light unnaturally bright, almost blinding. They stood in a perfect circle, their movements synchronized as they raised the lanterns high. Drive faster, I whispered, my voice shaking. Tyler didn't argue. The road out of the village twisted and turned, the forest growing denser with each mile. The lanterns followed us, their light bobbing and weaving in the trees. At first, I thought it was just the wind, but then I realized the lanterns were moving deliberately, as if they were alive. Do you see that? I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Tyler nodded, his knuckles white as he gripped the steering wheel. Yeah, and I don't think they're just lanterns. The car sputtered suddenly, the engine struggling as if something heavy was dragging us down. Tyler cursed under his breath, slamming his foot on the gas, but the car wouldn't go faster. Then we saw them, the lantern keepers. They emerged from the trees, their robes blending seamlessly with the shadows. Each one carried a lantern, the light illuminating their gaunt faces. Their eyes were hollow, dark pits that seemed to pull in the light. They moved slowly, deliberately, forming a line across the road ahead. Tyler slammed on the brakes, and the car skidded to a halt. What do we do? I asked, panic rising in my chest. We turn around, Tyler said, throwing the car into reverse. But when we looked behind us, the road was gone. The trees had closed in, their gnarled branches forming an impenetrable wall. "We're trapped," I whispered. The lantern keepers moved closer, their lanterns casting long, flickering shadows that danced across the car. Their chanting began, low and rhythmic, a sound that seemed to vibrate through my bones. "Get out," one of them said, their voice cold and mechanical, like wind howling through a hollow pipe. Tyler and I exchanged terrified glances. "We have to run," I said. "Into the woods? Are you insane?" Tyler shot back. "Do you have a better idea?" Before he could respond, the lantern light flared, blinding us. The car doors flew open on their own, and an invisible force yanked us out into the dirt. The lantern keepers surrounded us, their chanting growing louder. One of them stepped forward, their lantern swinging in front of them like a pendulum. "You have entered our domain," they intoned. "The lanterns guide, the lanterns judge, and now the lanterns will claim." "We didn't mean to come here," Tyler shouted. "We just got lost." "Intentions do not matter," the keeper replied. "You are here, and the harvest must be fulfilled." Before we could react, the lanterns flared again, and the world around us seemed to shift. The trees melted away, replaced by a vast, open field. The sky above was pitch black, dotted with stars that flickered like dying embers. At the center of the field stood a massive stone altar, its surface etched with strange symbols that glowed faintly in the lantern light. The keepers dragged us toward the altar, their grip cold and unyielding. Tyler struggled, but it was no use. Their strength was inhuman. As we reached the altar, one of the keepers produced a long, curved blade, its surface shimmering with an unnatural light. "The light demands sacrifice," they chanted. "The lanterns must be fed." "No," I screamed, thrashing against their grip. "Please, don't do this." But they didn't listen. The keeper raised the blade, and I closed my eyes, bracing for the end. Then, a deafening roar shattered the air, and the lanterns went dark. The keepers froze, their heads snapping toward the forest as the roar echoed again. Out of the darkness came a blinding light, brighter and purer than anything I'd ever seen. The keepers shrieked, their forms dissolving into shadows as the light consumed them. When I opened my eyes, Tyler and I were back on the road, the forest silent and still. The lanterns were gone, and the car engine hummed softly, as if nothing had happened. We didn't speak as Tyler drove, both of us too shaken to process what we just experienced. When we finally reached the highway, the first rays of dawn were breaking over the horizon, bathing the world in a golden light. We never spoke of Blackthorn Valley again, but the memories linger. Sometimes, late at night, I still see the flicker of lanterns in the corner of my vision, and I hear the distant echo of chanting. And I know the lantern keepers are still out there, waiting for their next harvest. I've never been the type to believe in urban legends or ghost stories. Growing up in the suburbs, my life was painfully average. But last summer, I stumbled into something so horrifying, so inexplicably real, that it still haunts me every night. It began with a dare. My cousin Caleb, a reckless thrill seeker, invited me to spend a week at his cabin deep in the Appalachian woods. The cabin was remote. No cell service, no internet, just miles of forest in every direction. He told me about a strange local legend, the Bloodwood Covenant. Back in the 1800s, Caleb explained one night over a campfire, there was this cult in the area. They believed the forest was alive, like literally alive, and that it demanded sacrifices to stay dormant. I laughed. "So, what? They just killed people to keep the trees happy?" Caleb grinned. "Pretty much. They do these crazy rituals, spilling blood on a sacred tree called the Bloodwood. Locals say the tree still stands, and if you find it, you'll see the offerings. Bones, carvings, all sorts of creepy stuff." I rolled my eyes. "Sounds like a campfire story." "Then prove it," Caleb challenged. "Let's find the Bloodwood." The next morning, armed with flashlights, a map, and more bravado than sense, we set out into the woods. Caleb claimed he'd heard rumors about its location from some old locals at the general store. "It's about 3 miles north," he said, "near a clearing where nothing else grows." As we hiked, the air grew colder, the forest darker. The trees here were ancient, their twisted branches forming a canopy so thick that barely any sunlight broke through. The silence was oppressive, broken only by the crunch of our boots and the occasional rustle of leaves. After about an hour, we reached the clearing. It was exactly as Caleb had described, a perfect circle of barren earth surrounded by towering trees. At the center stood the bloodwood. The tree was massive, its bark a deep, unnatural red that seemed to shimmer in the dim light. Its roots twisted like veins across the ground, and strange symbols were carved into its trunk. Intricate spirals, jagged lines, and what looked like human figures. Caleb whistled. Well, there it is. Told you it was real. I stepped closer, a chill running down my spine. The air around the tree felt different, heavier, almost electric. I noticed something hanging from the branches. Small, weathered wooden figurines tied with black string. What the hell are those? I asked. Offerings, maybe? Caleb suggested. Then we saw the bones. They were scattered around the base of the tree, small, brittle, and yellowed with age. Some were clearly animal, but others looked disturbingly human. Okay, this is officially creepy, I said, backing away. Let's go. But Caleb, ever the daredevil, grinned and pulled out his pocket knife. Not yet. I want to leave my mark. Before I could stop him, he approached the bloodwood and carved his initials into the bark. The moment his blade pierced the tree, a deep, guttural groan echoed through the clearing, as if the forest itself was alive. What the hell was that? I whispered, my heart racing. Caleb shrugged, but his cocky smirk was gone. Probably just the wind. We left in a hurry, neither of us admitting how scared we were. But that night, the real nightmare began. Before we could react, the cloaked figures appeared, surrounding us. Their leader stepped forward, pulling back his hood to reveal a face that was wrong. His skin was pale and cracked, like old porcelain, and his eyes burned with an unnatural red light. You have defiled the sacred tree, he said, his voice like grinding stone. The bloodwood demands retribution. Caleb fell to his knees, begging for mercy. But the leader simply raised his hand, and the ground beneath us began to shift. Roots shot up from the earth, wrapping around Caleb and dragging him toward the altar. He screamed, thrashing against their grip, but it was no use. I tried to help, but the roots were everywhere, coiling around my ankles and pulling me back. The last thing I saw before I passed out was Caleb being lifted onto the altar, his screams drowned out by the chanting. When I woke up, I was alone in the forest. The bloodwood stood in the distance, its bark darker than before, as if it had been freshly fed. I stumbled back to the cabin, but Caleb was gone. His car, his belongings, everything had vanished, as if he'd never been there. I eventually found my way back to civilization, but I couldn't bring myself to tell anyone what had happened. Who would believe me? Sometimes, late at night, I still hear the whispers, and when I close my eyes, I see the bloodwood, its roots reaching out, hungry for more, because the forest never forgets. When I was 19, I took a job as a caretaker for a remote estate in Maine. It was supposed to be an easy gig, a few weeks of light maintenance, keeping the place clean, and making sure the property didn't get vandalized while the owner, a reclusive author, was overseas. The house was old and massive, perched on a cliff overlooking the ocean. It had an eerie charm, the kind of place you'd expect to see in a gothic horror novel. The first few days passed uneventfully. I spent my time exploring the house's many rooms, marveling at the antique furniture and the dusty shelves lined with leather-bound books. But by the end of the week, I started to notice things that didn't feel quite right. It began with the noises, soft whispers that seemed to come from the walls, and the sound of footsteps echoing through the halls at night. At first, I chalked it up to the house settling, or my imagination playing tricks on me. But the whispers grew louder, and the footsteps closer. Then, one evening, I found the journal. I was dusting the study when I noticed a book lying on the floor near the desk. It wasn't like the others on the shelves. This one was bound in cracked, black leather and had no title. Curious, I opened it and discovered it wasn't a book at all. It was a journal. The entries were written in a shaky hand, detailing strange rituals and cryptic phrases about the hollow moon. One passage, dated 5 years earlier, caught my attention. On the night of the hollow moon, the veils will thin, the coven will gather, and the keeper will rise. Blood will be spilled, and the pact renewed. The words sent a chill down my spine, but I laughed it off. It was probably just the ramblings of the eccentric author, or so I thought. That night, the whispers returned, louder than ever. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, trying to convince myself it was just the wind. But then I heard something else, chanting. It was faint at first, a low, rhythmic murmur that seemed to come from outside. I got up and looked out the window, but all I could see was the moon, hanging low and unnaturally large in the sky. Its light was pale and sickly, casting long, twisting shadows across the lawn. The chanting grew louder, and I realized it wasn't coming from outside the house. It was coming from below it. I grabbed a flashlight and ventured into the basement. The air grew colder with every step, and the sound of chanting echoed off the stone walls. As I descended the stairs, the beam of my flashlight landed on something carved into the floor. A massive, intricate symbol that looked like a star encircled by twisting vines. In the center of the symbol was a trapdoor, its edges lined with runes that glowed faintly in the dark. The chanting was coming from below. I should have turned back, but something compelled me to open the trapdoor. As I lifted it, a gust of icy wind hit me, carrying with it the stench of damp earth and something metallic, blood. The tunnel beneath the trapdoor was narrow and damp, its walls lined with roots that seemed to pulse faintly, as if alive. I followed the sound of the chanting, my heart pounding in my chest. The further I went, the louder it grew, until it filled my head, drowning out my own thoughts. Eventually, the tunnel opened into a massive underground chamber. The sight before me stopped me in my tracks. A group of people in dark robes stood in a circle around an altar made of black stone. The altar was covered in strange carvings and fresh blood, which dripped onto the floor in a steady rhythm. On the altar lay a man, his face pale and his eyes wide with terror. The robed figures held knives, their blades gleaming in the flickering light of the torches that lined the chamber. They chanted in unison, their voices echoing through the cavern. "We summon thee, keeper of the hollow moon. Come forth and accept our offering." I wanted to run, but my legs wouldn't move. I was frozen, a spectator to the horrifying ritual unfolding before me. One of the figures raised their knife, chanting louder. The others joined in, their voices reaching a fever pitch. Then, the room began to shake. The symbol carved into the floor glowed brighter, and the air grew thick with a strange, humming energy. The man on the altar let out a final, blood-curdling scream as the knife plunged into his chest. His blood spilled over the altar, soaking into the carvings and making the glow even brighter. The chanting stopped abruptly, and for a moment, there was silence. Then, the keeper arrived. The air in the chamber grew impossibly cold, and the torches dimmed. From the glowing symbol on the floor, a figure began to emerge. It was tall and thin, its body covered in pale, translucent skin that stretched tightly over its bones. Its eyes were hollow, and its mouth was filled with rows of jagged teeth. The keeper let out a guttural roar, its voice echoing through the chamber. The robed figures fell to their knees, bowing before it. I pressed myself against the wall, trying to stay out of sight, but the keeper's head snapped toward me. Its empty eyes locked onto mine, and I felt a cold, creeping dread wash over me. One of the robed figures spoke, their voice trembling. "Master, forgive this intruder. They mean no harm." The keeper let out a low growl, and the robed figure turned to me. "Leave this place. Now." I didn't need to be told twice. I scrambled back through the tunnel, my flashlight barely illuminating the way. The walls seemed to close in around me, and I could hear the keeper's guttural growls echoing behind me. When I finally emerged into the basement, I slammed the trapdoor shut and ran upstairs. I didn't stop until I was outside, the cold night air filling my lungs. The moon was still low in the sky, its pale light casting an unnatural glow over the estate. I jumped into my car and sped away. not looking back. The next morning, I tried to report what I'd seen to the local authorities, but they didn't believe me. They chalked it up to stress or an overactive imagination. I quit the caretaker job and left Maine, vowing never to return. But the experience stayed with me, haunting my dreams and invading my thoughts. Sometimes, late at night, I can still hear the keeper's growl and the faint echo of chanting. And when the moon is full, I catch glimpses of a pale figure in the shadows, watching, waiting. Because once you've seen the hollow moon, it never lets you go. It was the summer before college, and my best friend, Mia, and I were on a road trip to celebrate our newfound freedom. We didn't have a destination in mind, just a map, a full tank of gas, and a desire to explore. Somewhere along the winding backroads of the Midwest, our car broke down in the middle of nowhere. As we debated what to do, we spotted a faded wooden sign at the edge of the road. Welcome to Whispering Pines. Population 412. The town was nowhere on the map, but with no cell service and the sun sinking fast, we decided to walk the mile or so to the town and look for help. Whispering Pines looked like it had been frozen in time. The streets were lined with quaint wooden houses, their paint peeling from years of neglect. A single gas station, a diner, and a small general store sat clustered in the town center. It was quiet, too quiet. "Where is everyone?" Mia whispered, her voice echoing in the stillness. We walked into the diner, the bell above the door jangling loudly. A waitress with a fixed, unnatural smile greeted us. Her uniform looked like it belonged in the 1950s, and her eyes never quite met ours. "Evening, folks," she said in a sing-song voice. "Y'all just passing through?" "Our car broke down outside of town," I explained. "Is there a mechanic nearby?" Her smile faltered for the briefest moment before returning, wider than before. "Oh, don't you worry about that. We'll take care of everything." The mechanic, an older man with grease-streaked hands and a hollow gaze, towed our car into town. "Might take a day or two," he muttered, avoiding eye contact. With no choice but to stay the night, Mia and I booked a room at the only motel in town. The clerk, an elderly woman with wispy white hair, handed us a key without a word. The room was sparse but clean, with twin beds and a single window overlooking the town square. As night fell, a heavy silence blanketed Whispering Pines. Then the whispers began. At first, I thought it was just the wind, but as I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, I realized the sound was coming from inside the room. It was faint but distinct, words I couldn't quite make out. "Mia, do you hear that?" I whispered. She sat up, her eyes wide. "Yeah, what is it?" We searched the room, checking the closet, under the beds, and even the vents, but found nothing. The whispers grew louder, more insistent. They seemed to be coming from the walls themselves. Then, they stopped. The next morning, we tried to leave town, but every road out of Whispering Pines looped back into the town center. It was as if the town itself wouldn't let us go. The townsfolk acted as if nothing was wrong, their smiles too wide, their gazes too vacant. Every time we asked for help or directions, they gave the same response. "Don't you worry about that. Everything will be taken care of." Desperate, we decided to explore the town and see if we could find anything unusual, anything that could explain what was happening. We found it in the church. The building was old and weathered, its white paint chipped and its steeple leaning slightly to one side. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of mildew and candle wax. At the front of the room stood an altar, and behind it, a massive wooden carving of a tree. The tree was unlike anything I'd ever seen. Its twisted branches reached toward the ceiling, and its roots coiled around the base of the altar like serpents. Symbols were etched into the wood, spirals, jagged lines, and what looked like faces screaming in agony. As we approached the altar, Mia gasped. "Look at this." She pointed to a book lying open on the pulpit. The pages were filled with strange symbols and diagrams, along with handwritten notes in a language I didn't recognize. One passage was written in English. "The binding ritual ensures the survival of Whispering Pines. On the night of the blood moon, the offering must be made." Before we could make sense of the words, we heard footsteps. "Someone's coming," Mia hissed. We ducked behind a pew as the church door creaked open. A group of townsfolk entered, their faces hidden by hoods. They moved silently, filing into the pews as if preparing for a service. Then, the whispers returned. They seemed to come from nowhere and everywhere at once, growing louder until the hooded figures joined in, chanting in unison. We bind thee to the roots. We feed thee with the blood. We give ourselves to thee. The air grew heavy, and the wooden carving of the tree began to glow faintly. Mia and I didn't stick around to see what would happen next. We slipped out of the church and ran back to the motel, our hearts pounding. "We need to get out of here," Mia said, her voice trembling. I nodded. But how? The roads. There has to be another way. That night, we packed our bags and waited until the town was silent. Then, under the cover of darkness, we made our way back to the church. If the answers to Whispering Pine's strange rituals were anywhere, they'd be there. Inside the church, we found a trapdoor hidden beneath the altar. It creaked loudly as we opened it, revealing a narrow staircase descending into darkness. Armed with flashlights, we descended into the earth. The air grew colder, and the whispers grew louder. The walls of the tunnel were lined with roots, their surfaces pulsing faintly as if alive. The tunnel opened into a massive underground chamber. At its center was a pool of dark, viscous liquid surrounded by stones carved with the same strange symbols we'd seen in the church. Above the pool hung a massive root, twisted and gnarled, dripping with the same dark liquid. The whispers seemed to emanate from the root itself. As we approached the pool, we heard footsteps behind us. Going somewhere? We turned to see the hooded figures from the church, their faces now visible. Their eyes glowed faintly in the darkness, and their smiles were too wide, too sharp. The binding ritual must be completed, one of them said. You cannot leave. Mia grabbed my arm. Run. We bolted back through the tunnel, the hooded figures close behind. The whispers turned into a deafening roar, and the roots along the walls seemed to reach for us, their tendrils brushing against our skin. When we emerged into the church, we barricaded the trapdoor with whatever we could find and ran out into the night. The moon was high in the sky, its light blood red. The townsfolk were gathered in the square, their chanting filling the air. We sprinted to the mechanic shop, hoping to find our car fixed. To our shock, it was there, the keys sitting on the dashboard. Without questioning our luck, we jumped in and sped out of town. This time, the road didn't loop back. We didn't stop driving until the sun rose, and we were miles away from Whispering Pines. When we finally pulled over, we sat in silence, trying to process what had happened. To this day, I don't know what we witnessed in that town. I tried to look it up later, but Whispering Pines doesn't exist on any map or online record. But sometimes, late at night, I hear the whispers again, and when the moon is full, I dream of roots twisting through the earth, reaching out for me. Because some places aren't meant to be found, and some rituals are never meant to be interrupted. When I was 21, I worked as a housekeeper for Blackthorn Manor, an old Victorian mansion tucked away in the dense forests of Oregon. The manor belonged to the Blackthorn family, a reclusive lineage whose history was shrouded in mystery and whispers of dark secrets. The job seemed straightforward: clean the house, maintain the gardens, and stay out of the family's private quarters. The pay was generous, and the idea of spending the summer in such a grand, historic home intrigued me. But from the moment I arrived, I felt something was off. The first thing I noticed was the smell. The air inside the manor was heavy with the scent of damp wood and something metallic, like blood. The corridors were lined with portraits of Blackthorn ancestors, their eyes seeming to follow me wherever I went. Don't go into the West Wing, Mrs. Hargrove, the head housekeeper, warned me on my first day. Her voice was stern, but there was an edge of fear to it. Why not? I asked. She hesitated, her gaze darting to the ground. It's off limits. That's all you need to know. For the first few days, I stuck to my assigned tasks, cleaning the East Wing, dusting the Grand Library, and tending to the sprawling gardens. The Blackthorn family, an elderly matriarch named Eleanor and her 2 adult sons, Victor and Samuel, kept mostly to themselves. Eleanor was a frail woman with piercing blue eyes that seemed to see straight through me. Victor and Samuel were polite but distant, their conversations always laced with cryptic remarks about the old ways. It wasn't long before I started hearing strange noises at night. The sounds began as faint whispers, barely audible over the creaks and groans of the old house. They seemed to come from the walls, growing louder as the hours stretched into the early morning. One night, I heard footsteps outside my room. When I opened the door, the hallway was empty, but the faint smell of burning wax lingered in the air. I decided to ask Mrs. Hargrove about it the next morning. Her face turned pale, and she gripped my arm tightly. "Do not ask questions you don't want answers to," she said, her voice trembling. Despite her warning, my curiosity got the better of me. One evening, after the family had retired to their quarters, I wandered into the west wing. The air grew colder as I ventured deeper into the forbidden area. The walls were lined with more portraits, but these were different. The faces were distorted, their expressions twisted in agony. At the end of the hallway, I found a locked door. It was heavy and reinforced with iron, its surface carved with strange symbols I didn't recognize. As I ran my fingers over the carvings, I heard a voice behind me. "You shouldn't be here." I spun around to see Samuel standing a few feet away, his face shadowed in the dim light. I got lost," I stammered. He didn't believe me. I could see it in his eyes. But he simply nodded and escorted me back to my room. "Stay where you're supposed to," he said before leaving. "For your own good." That night, the whispers grew louder, turning into chants. I couldn't understand the words, but the rhythm was hypnotic, almost like a heartbeat. The next day, I decided to explore the manor's library, hoping to find something that would explain what was happening. The shelves were filled with ancient books, their spines cracked and faded. One in particular caught my eye, a leather-bound tome with no title. Inside, I found pages filled with intricate drawings of symbols, rituals, and what looked like human sacrifices. One passage sent a chill down my spine. To appease the Shadow King, the blood of the willing must be spilled beneath the blackthorn moon. The pact ensures the family's power and prosperity. Before I could read more, Victor entered the library. His expression was calm, but there was something menacing in his gaze. "Fascinated by our family's history, are you?" he asked, closing the book and placing it back on the shelf. I tried to play it off, mumbling something about the architecture of the manor. He smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "You should be careful what you read," he said. "Some things are better left in the dark." That night, I couldn't sleep. The chanting returned, louder than ever, and the smell of burning wax filled the air. I crept out of my room, following the sound to the west wing. The iron door was ajar, and a faint light spilled into the hallway. Inside, I found a staircase spiraling downward into the earth. The chanting grew louder as I descended, the air growing colder with each step. At the bottom, I entered a cavernous room lit by dozens of candles. The Blackthorn family stood in a circle, their faces illuminated by the flickering light. In the center of the room was an altar made of black stone, its surface stained with dried blood. Above it, suspended by chains, was a figure cloaked in shadow. Its form was indistinct, shifting like smoke, but its eyes burned like hot coals. The chanting stopped as Eleanor stepped forward, a dagger in her hand. She began to speak in a language I didn't understand, her voice strong despite her frail appearance. Victor and Samuel stood on either side of her, their expressions blank, almost trance-like. I tried to back away, but my foot slipped, and I knocked over a candle. The sound echoed through the chamber, and all eyes turned toward me. "What are you doing here?" Eleanor's voice was cold, devoid of the warmth she usually feigned. Before I could answer, the shadowy figure above the altar let out a low, guttural growl. The chains rattled, and the air grew thick with a suffocating energy. "She must be part of the offering," Victor said, his voice flat. "No." Samuel's voice cut through the tension. "She doesn't belong to this." Eleanor silenced him with a glare. "The pact must be fulfilled." I turned and ran, the sound of footsteps echoing behind me. The walls of the tunnel seemed to close in, the roots writhing like living things. When I reached the staircase, Samuel caught up to me. "Go," he whispered urgently, shoving a key into my hand. There's a car in the old shed out back. Take it and leave. Don't ever come back." I didn't wait to ask questions. I ran through the west wing, out the back door, and into the night. The car was ancient, but started on the first try. As I sped away, I glanced in the rearview mirror. The manor loomed in the distance, its windows glowing with an eerie, flickering light. The next morning, I called the police, but when they arrived, Blackthorn Manor was gone. The clearing where it had stood was overgrown with weeds, as if the house had never existed. Years later, I still dream of the chanting and the shadowy figure. I've researched the Blackthorn family, but there's no record of them anywhere. Sometimes, I wonder if they succeeded in their ritual. If the Shadow King still watches from the darkness, waiting. Because some secrets are meant to stay buried, and some doors should never be opened. The Hollow Grove Pact. When I was 17, my family moved to a rural town called Hollow Grove. It was small and unremarkable, nestled deep in the Appalachian Mountains. My father had gotten a job managing a lumber mill, and we were eager to start fresh after years of city life. The townsfolk were polite but distant. They rarely made eye contact, and their smiles never seemed to reach their eyes. There was something about the place that felt off. I first noticed it in the woods. The forest that surrounded Hollow Grove was ancient, its towering trees casting long, dark shadows even at noon. On our first week in town, I decided to explore the woods behind our house. As I walked deeper, I came across a clearing. In the center of the clearing stood a massive oak tree, its twisted branches reaching toward the sky like gnarled fingers. At its base was a circle of stones, each one etched with strange symbols. The ground around the tree was blackened, as if it had been burned. I felt a chill run down my spine and decided to head back home. But as I turned, I noticed something carved into the tree's bark. The pact is eternal. That night, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone, or something, was watching me. Every creak of the house, every rustle of leaves outside, made my heart race. At dinner, I mentioned the tree to my parents. My dad frowned, his fork pausing midair. "Stay out of those woods," he said firmly. "They're dangerous." "But why?" I asked. He didn't answer, and my mom quickly changed the subject. A week later, during a town meeting at the community center, I overheard two older women whispering. "Did you hear about the missing boy?" one asked. The other nodded, her face pale. "Second one this month. It's the woods, they're cursed." When they noticed me listening, they fell silent and quickly walked away. That night, I couldn't stop thinking about what they'd said. Cursed woods? Missing children? What was going on in Hollow Grove? Determined to find answers, I decided to explore the woods again. This time, I brought my friend Ellie, the only other teenager in town who seemed even remotely normal. "Are you sure about this?" Ellie asked as we approached the clearing. "My grandma says the woods belong to the Hollow Men." "The Hollow Men?" I repeated, laughing nervously. "It's just an old story," she said, but her voice was shaky. "Something about spirits who live in the trees and demand sacrifices to keep the town safe." I rolled my eyes but couldn't ignore the unease in her tone. When we reached the clearing, the air felt heavy, almost suffocating. The oak tree loomed above us, its twisted branches casting eerie shadows in the moonlight. Ellie pointed to the circle of stones. "Those symbols, they're warnings. Warnings for what?" Before she could answer, we heard a low, guttural sound, a mix between a growl and a whisper. "Did you hear that?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Ellie grabbed my arm. "We need to leave. Now." As we turned to run, I tripped over something half buried in the dirt. It was a bone, a human bone. Panic set in as the whispers grew louder, surrounding us. The shadows seemed to shift and move, as if something was watching us from the trees. We sprinted back to my house, slamming the door behind us. "What was that?" Ellie gasped, her face pale. "I don't know," I said, my hands trembling, "but I think we found out what happened to the missing kids." The next day, I tried to tell my parents what we'd seen, but they brushed it off as teenage imagination. Frustrated, I decided to do some research. At the town library, I found an old book about Hollow Grove's history. Hidden in the back was a section about the town's founding. According to the book, The settlers of Hollow Grove had made a pact with something they called the Hollow King, a spirit or deity that lived in the forest. In exchange for prosperity and protection, the townsfolk would offer sacrifices during the harvest moon. The more I read, the colder I felt. That night was the harvest moon. The entire town gathered in the square for the annual festival. There were food stalls, games, and music, but the atmosphere felt wrong. Ellie and I stuck together, keeping an eye on the woods. As the night wore on, the townsfolk began to disappear, one by one. "Where is everyone going?" I whispered. Ellie pointed to the woods. "Look." A line of people, their faces hidden by hoods, was walking toward the clearing. We followed them, keeping a safe distance. When we reached the clearing, we hid behind a cluster of bushes and watched in horror. The townsfolk had formed a circle around the oak tree. At the center was a young boy, no older than 8, tied to the tree with thick ropes. He was crying, begging for help. Eleanor Black, the mayor, stepped forward, holding a ceremonial dagger. She began to chant in a language I didn't recognize, her voice rising and falling in rhythm with the whispers that filled the air. The shadows around the tree began to move, coiling and writhing like living things. As the mayor raised the dagger, Ellie let out a gasp. The sound drew the attention of one of the hooded figures, who turned and pointed in our direction. "Run!" I yelled, grabbing Ellie's hand. We sprinted through the woods, the whispers growing louder with every step. The shadows seemed to follow us, stretching and twisting in impossible ways. When we finally burst out of the forest and into my backyard, we didn't stop running until we were inside the house. The next morning, the boy's face was on the news. He was listed as missing, just like the others. I tried to tell my parents what we'd seen, but they didn't believe me. My dad warned me again to stay out of the woods, his face pale and drawn. "We can't leave, can we?" I asked, my voice trembling. He didn't answer. That night, I heard footsteps outside my window. Peeking through the curtains, I saw a group of hooded figures standing in the yard, their faces hidden in shadow. One of them raised a hand, pointing directly at me. Ellie and I knew we had to leave. We packed what we could and waited until the town was asleep. Then, under the cover of darkness, we ran. We never looked back. Years later, I tried to find Hollow Grove on a map, but it was as if the town had never existed. Sometimes, I still hear the whispers in my dreams, calling me back to the woods. And when the harvest moon rises, I wonder if the Hollow King still waits beneath the twisted branches of the oak tree, demanding his due. When I was a sophomore in college, I joined a small archaeology club that specialized in uncovering local history. It wasn't a big deal, mostly small digs and research at forgotten cemeteries and abandoned buildings. But one summer, our advisor, Dr. Kane, received a tip about an ancient site deep in the Appalachian wilderness. The locals called it the Sanctuary. Nobody knew its origins, but the area was rumored to be cursed. Stories of disappearances, strange rituals, and ghostly figures had surrounded the place for generations. Naturally, our group of young, ambitious students was thrilled at the prospect. We didn't take the warnings seriously. We should have. The journey to the sanctuary was grueling. After hours of driving, we parked near an old, overgrown trail and hiked for miles through dense forest. The deeper we went, the quieter it became. Birds stopped singing, and even the sound of the wind seemed to vanish. By the time we reached the site, an uneasy tension had settled over our group. The sanctuary was unlike anything I'd ever seen. It was a circular stone structure, partially buried in the earth. The stones were massive, blackened with age, and carved with intricate symbols. Dr. Kane was ecstatic. This could predate any known civilization in the region, he said, running his fingers over the carvings. But I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. We set up camp a short distance from the site and began our work the next morning. The first thing we noticed was the strange layout of the structure. There were 12 stones forming a circle, each one inscribed with a different symbol. In the center was a flat, altar-like slab, its surface scarred with deep grooves. One of my friends, Lisa, joked, "Looks like the perfect spot for a human sacrifice." Nobody laughed. As the day wore on, we discovered something even more disturbing. Beneath the altar was a hidden chamber, accessible through a narrow stone staircase. Dr. Kane insisted we explore it. This could be the find of a lifetime, he said, his eyes gleaming with excitement. The chamber was dark and cold, the air thick with the scent of decay. The walls were lined with shelves, each holding strange artifacts, jars filled with blackened ash, animal bones tied with string, and small, crudely carved figurines. In the center of the room was a massive stone pedestal, and atop it sat a black book. The book's cover was made of some kind of leathery material that felt wrong to the touch. Its pages were filled with symbols and diagrams, alongside text written in a language none of us recognized. Dr. Kane took the book, ignoring our protests. This could be the key to understanding the entire site, he said. That night, the forest came alive with sounds. Whispers carried on the wind, rustling leaves, and the distant echo of footsteps. We stayed close to the fire, our nerves on edge. The next morning, things got worse. Lisa, who'd been the first to joke about the altar, was gone. Her sleeping bag was empty, and her boots were missing. We searched the woods for hours, but found no trace of her. Dr. Kane insisted we stay. She probably wandered off and got lost, he said, though he looked as scared as the rest of us. That evening, he began translating the book using notes from an old language guide. This isn't just a sanctuary, he said, his voice trembling. It's a place of worship for something ancient, something evil. The Forgotten Sanctuary. When I was a sophomore in college, I joined a small archaeology club that specialized in uncovering local history. It wasn't a big deal, mostly small digs and research at forgotten cemeteries and abandoned buildings. But one summer, our advisor, Dr. Kane, received a tip about an ancient site deep in the Appalachian wilderness. The locals called it the Sanctuary. Nobody knew its origins, but the area was rumored to be cursed. Stories of disappearances, strange rituals, and ghostly figures had surrounded the place for generations. Naturally, our group of young, ambitious students was thrilled at the prospect. We didn't take the warnings seriously. We should have. The journey to the sanctuary was grueling. After hours of driving, we parked near an old, overgrown trail and hiked for miles through dense forest. The deeper we went, the quieter it became. Birds stopped singing, and even the sound of the wind seemed to vanish. By the time we reached the site, an uneasy tension had settled over our group. The sanctuary was unlike anything I'd ever seen. It was a circular stone structure, partially buried in the earth. The stones were massive, blackened with age, and carved with intricate symbols. Dr. Kane was ecstatic. This could predate any known civilization in the region, he said, running his fingers over the carvings. But I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. We set up camp a short distance from the site and began our work the next morning. The first thing we noticed was the strange layout of the structure. There were 12 stones forming a circle, each one inscribed with a different symbol. In the center was a flat, altar-like slab, its surface scarred with deep grooves. One of my friends, Lisa, joked, "Looks like the perfect spot for a human sacrifice." Nobody laughed. As the day wore on, we discovered something even more disturbing. Beneath the altar was a hidden chamber, accessible through a narrow stone staircase. Dr. Kane insisted we explore it. This could be the find of a lifetime, he said, his eyes gleaming with excitement. The chamber was dark and cold, the air thick with the scent of decay. The walls were lined with shelves, each holding strange artifacts, jars filled with blackened ash, animal bones tied with string, and small, crudely carved figurines. In the center of the room was a massive stone pedestal, and atop it sat a black book. The book's cover was made of some kind of leathery material that felt wrong to the touch. Its pages were filled with symbols and diagrams, alongside text written in a language none of us recognized. Dr. Kane took the book, ignoring our protests. This could be the key to understanding the entire site, he said. That night, the forest came alive with sounds. Whispers carried on the wind, rustling leaves, and the distant echo of footsteps. We stayed close to the fire, our nerves on edge. The next morning, things got worse. Lisa, who'd been the first to joke about the altar, was gone. Her sleeping bag was empty, and her boots were missing. We searched the woods for hours, but found no trace of her. Dr. Kane insisted we stay. She probably wandered off and got lost, he said, though he looked as scared as the rest of us. That evening, he began translating the book using notes from an old language guide. "This isn't just a sanctuary," he said, his voice trembling. "It's a place of worship for something ancient, something evil." According to the book, the site was dedicated to a being called the Hollow One. The text described rituals meant to summon and appease it, including sacrifices of blood. "It's mythology," Dr. Kane said, trying to reassure us. But none of us believed him. That night, I woke to the sound of chanting. I crawled out of my tent and saw Dr. Kane standing by the altar, the book in his hands. His voice was low and guttural, speaking words I didn't understand. "Dr. Kane?" I called out. He didn't respond. The others woke up and joined me, watching in horror as Dr. Kane continued his chant. The air around the altar seemed to ripple, and the symbols on the stones began to glow faintly. Suddenly, he stopped. His head snapped toward us, and his eyes were empty, like black voids. "You shouldn't be here," he said, his voice layered with something inhuman. Then he collapsed. We dragged him back to camp, but he wouldn't wake up. His breathing was shallow, and his skin was ice cold. The next morning, we found strange markings carved into the trees around our camp, symbols that matched those on the stones. Lisa's body was discovered near the altar, her eyes wide open and her face frozen in terror. We wanted to leave, but the forest seemed different, like it had shifted during the night. The path we'd taken to get there was gone, replaced by dense thickets of trees. As night fell, the whispers returned, louder and more distinct. They came from every direction, voices calling our names. Then, the chanting started again, but this time it wasn't Dr. Kane. The sound came from the woods, growing louder and closer. Shapes began to emerge from the shadows. Figures draped in tattered robes, their faces hidden. They surrounded our camp, their voices blending into an eerie, hypnotic harmony. One of them stepped forward, pointing to the altar. "We must leave," I whispered, but none of us could move. It was as if their presence rooted us in place. The figure gestured again, more forcefully this time. The message was clear. Someone had to go to the altar. Dr. Kane, now awake but dazed, stood and walked toward the stone circle. "No," I shouted, grabbing his arm, but his strength was unnatural, and he shoved me aside as if I weighed nothing. He climbed onto the altar and lay down, his arms stretched out at his sides. The chanting grew louder, and the glowing symbols flared brighter than before. The figures began to sway, their movements synchronized with the rhythm of the chant. Then, the air split open. That's the only way I can describe it. A tear in reality appeared above the altar, and from it emerged a shadowy form. It had no defined shape, but its presence was overwhelming, filling the air with a suffocating dread. The Hollow One reached down, its shadowy tendrils wrapping around Dr. Kane. He screamed, a sound so raw and primal that it made my blood run cold. The figures in the robes fell to their knees, bowing before the entity. I don't know how I found the strength to move, but I grabbed the black book from our camp and threw it into the fire. As the pages burned, the chanting faltered, and the Hollow One let out an ear-piercing shriek. The figures dissolved into the shadows, and the glowing symbols faded. The forest returned to silence, but Dr. Kane was gone. We didn't wait to see what would happen next. Somehow, we found our way back to the trail and didn't stop running until we reached the car. When we reported what happened, the authorities dismissed our story as hysteria. The site was never found again, and the book was gone, its ashes scattered by the wind. To this day, I can still hear the whispers in my dreams. Sometimes, when I'm alone at night, I feel the air ripple around me, and I wonder if the Hollow One remembers us, and if it's still waiting for its next offering. When I was a junior in high school, my history teacher, Mr. Grayson, gave us a group project: research a local legend or myth and present its historical significance. It sounded simple enough, and my group, consisting of me, my best friend Mark, and a quiet girl named Clara, chose a story we'd all heard growing up, the legend of the Red Circle. The Red Circle was a rumored cult that supposedly operated in the rural outskirts of our town. People whispered about their rituals in hushed tones, claiming they worshipped a blood god and performed human sacrifices in exchange for power and immortality. We thought it was just another spooky story to keep kids from wandering too far into the woods, but we were wrong. Our research began with local archives. We found a handful of old newspaper articles dating back to the late 1800s. The articles spoke of strange disappearances and symbols painted in blood on trees and barn doors. The victims were never found, and the case was abandoned due to lack of evidence. Mark, always the skeptic, scoffed at the idea of a cult. "It's probably just some bored kids pulling pranks," he said. But Clara, who rarely spoke unless she had something important to say, disagreed. "There's something real about this," she said quietly. "My grandmother used to warn me about the Red Circle. She said they were more than just a myth. I didn't know what to believe, but I was curious." One article mentioned an abandoned farmhouse deep in the woods where the cult was said to have held their rituals. It was about 5 miles outside of town, on land no one dared to claim. Mark and I decided to check it out after school. Clara was hesitant, but eventually agreed to come along. The hike to the farmhouse was uneventful at first. The woods were eerily quiet, the air heavy with the scent of damp earth and decaying leaves. As we got closer, we noticed strange carvings on the trees, circles with jagged lines radiating from their centers. Clara stopped in her tracks. "That's it," she whispered, pointing at one of the symbols, the Red Circle. When we reached the farmhouse, it was just as creepy as we'd imagined. The building was old and weathered, its roof sagging and windows shattered. Red paint? Or maybe something else? Streaked the door in the shape of the cult symbol. Mark pushed the door open, and it creaked loudly, echoing through the empty rooms. The air inside was cold, and the floorboards groaned under our weight. The living room was filled with remnants of rituals. Melted candles, faded photographs of people we didn't recognize, and a large wooden table covered in dark stains. In the center of the room was a circle etched into the floor, its grooves filled with something that looked like dried blood. "This is insane," I whispered, my voice trembling. Mark, trying to act brave, stepped closer to the circle. "It's just some creepy old house," he said. "There's no cult." Before he could finish, Clara let out a gasp. She was staring at the far wall, where a series of photos hung in crooked frames. The photos showed groups of people standing in front of the farmhouse, their faces hidden by dark hoods. But what made my blood run cold was the last photo in the row. It was of us. We bolted out of the house, our hearts pounding. I don't think any of us spoke until we were back in town. Mark tried to rationalize it, saying it was some elaborate prank, but Clara and I weren't convinced. The next day, we presented our findings to Mr. Grayson. He listened carefully, his face unreadable, and then asked us to stay after class. "I don't think you kids realize what you've stumbled onto," he said once the room was empty. "The Red Circle isn't just a story." He went on to explain that the cult had been active for over a century, its members passing their secrets down through generations. They believed in summoning a blood god that would grant them immortality, but the rituals required human sacrifices. "Stay away from that farmhouse," he warned, "and don't go digging any deeper." Of course, we didn't listen. That night, I couldn't sleep. The image of the photograph showing us at the farmhouse was burned into my mind. Who had taken it? How had it gotten there? Mark called me around midnight. "We have to go back," he said. "We need to figure out what's really going on." I reluctantly agreed, and Clara insisted on coming with us, even though she was visibly terrified. When we returned to the farmhouse, the air was even colder than before, and the woods were unnaturally silent. As we stepped inside, we noticed something new. The circle on the floor was glowing faintly, pulsing like a heartbeat. "What is that?" Clara whispered, clutching my arm. Before I could answer, the door slammed shut behind us. The room filled with whispers, low and guttural, in a language I didn't understand. Shadows began to shift and stretch along the walls, forming the shapes of hooded figures. Mark tried to open the door, but it wouldn't budge. "What's happening?" he shouted, panic rising in his voice. Clara pointed at the circle. "It's them," she said, her voice shaking. The red circle. One of the shadowy figures stepped forward, its face hidden beneath a hood. It raised a hand, and the whispers grew louder, deafening. I felt a sharp pain in my head, like something was trying to claw its way into my mind. Images flashed before my eyes. Rituals, sacrifices, and the blood god. A towering, faceless entity wreathed in darkness and dripping with blood. Mark screamed, falling to his knees. Clara grabbed my hand, pulling me toward the window. "We have to get out of here," she shouted. Using a heavy wooden chair, we broke the glass and climbed out, dragging Mark with us. As we ran through the woods, the whispers followed us, growing louder and more frantic. When we finally made it back to town, the noise stopped. The silence was almost as unsettling as the whispers. The next day, Mark didn't show up to school. When I went to his house, his parents said he packed a bag and left in the middle of the night. We never saw him again. Clara and I tried to move on, but the events of that night haunted us. Every so often, I'd see the red circle symbol carved into a tree or painted on an abandoned building. One night, I woke up to find it etched into my bedroom wall, dripping with fresh blood. Clara called me the next morning, her voice trembling. "They're not done with us," she said. "It's been years since that summer, but I still feel their presence. I've moved to a new city, far from my hometown, but the symbols keep appearing. And every time the moon is full, I hear the whispers again, calling me back to the farmhouse. I don't know what they want or why they chose us, but one thing is certain. The red circle never forgets. When I was younger, I always thought the scariest things were the ones you could see. The monsters in movies, the creepy shadows at night, the noises in the dark. But as I got older, I realized that the real horror lies in the things you can't see. The things that are hidden from your view, lurking just beyond your understanding. The Hollow Temple was one of those things. It started when I moved to a small town in the middle of nowhere. My dad got a job at the local school, and we had to relocate from the bustling city to a quiet, almost eerie place surrounded by dense forests and mist-covered hills. I hated it at first. The silence was deafening, the streets empty. The houses all looked the same. Old, made of brick with cracked windows and rusted gates. But there was something else that bothered me more than anything. The people. The locals weren't outright unfriendly, but they had a coldness about them. No one ever really smiled, and they always seemed to be watching you, like they knew something you didn't. There were rumors, talk about a cult that had existed in the area for generations, a group so secretive and powerful that people were afraid to speak about it. They called themselves the Keepers. It didn't take long before I heard whispers about their temple. No one knew exactly where it was, but people said that on certain nights, if you walked deep enough into the woods, you could hear chanting or see strange lights glowing in the trees. The stories were so detailed that they didn't seem like just tall tales anymore. They felt like warnings. I tried to ignore them, but curiosity got the best of me. I couldn't help myself. One evening, when I was out walking, I heard it, faint at first, then growing louder with every step. The chanting. It was coming from the forest. I had to see what it was. It wasn't just curiosity at that point. Something inside me was pulling me toward the sound, like a magnetic force that I couldn't resist. I didn't tell my parents or anyone else. I just grabbed my jacket and walked toward the trees. The air grew colder as I entered the woods, and the chanting became clearer, though still distant. The trees were thick, their branches tangled above me like a web. I couldn't tell if it was the wind or something else, but I had this feeling that I wasn't alone. Then I saw it. Through the trees, just barely visible through the fog, was a stone structure. It looked ancient, covered in vines and moss, as if it had been there for centuries. I froze in place. My heart pounded in my chest, and I felt a cold sweat break out on my forehead. The chanting was louder now, echoing through the forest, but it wasn't just one voice. There were many voices, layered on top of each other, chanting in unison. And then I saw them. Figures moved around the stone structure, their faces hidden beneath hoods. They seemed to be performing some kind of ritual, dancing in a circle around the altar in the center. There were candles lit, casting an eerie orange glow, and strange symbols were etched into the stone floor, glowing faintly. The air felt thick, heavy with something I couldn't quite explain. I wanted to run. I wanted to turn around and get out of there as fast as I could, but my feet wouldn't move. I was frozen, trapped in place by some unseen force. The chanting stopped abruptly, and for a brief moment, there was silence. Then one of the hooded figures turned, their head tilting toward me, as if they had sensed my presence. My blood ran cold. The figure reached up and pulled back its hood, revealing a face that made my stomach churn. Its skin was pale, almost sickly, with dark veins running beneath the surface. The eyes were hollow, black like pits, and there was something about the way it looked at me that made me feel like I was being devoured. Without a word, the figure turned back to the altar and began chanting again, louder this time. The others joined in, and the ground beneath me seemed to vibrate with the sound. I could feel the air growing thick, the temperature dropping, and an overwhelming sense of dread filled my chest. I had to leave. I turned and ran, my legs moving faster than they ever had before. I didn't stop to look back, but I could feel their eyes on me. I could hear the chanting fading behind me, but it didn't feel like it was moving away. It felt like it was following me, getting closer, creeping into my mind. The trees blurred around me as I pushed through the forest, desperate to get to safety. When I finally made it back to the edge of the woods, I collapsed, gasping for breath. I looked back, but there was nothing. The chanting had stopped, and the trees stood still, quiet as if nothing had happened. But I knew something had. The next day, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Everywhere I went, I felt eyes on me. I couldn't focus in class, couldn't sleep at night. The image of that figure's face, its empty eyes, haunted me. I tried to tell my parents what had happened, but they brushed it off, telling me I must have imagined it. They told me not to go near the woods again, but by then, it was too late. I knew there was something there, something ancient, something evil, and I needed to understand it. So I returned to the temple. This time, I wasn't alone. Mark, a friend I'd made since moving to town, insisted on coming with me. He didn't believe the stories, didn't believe in the cult or the dark powers they supposedly worshipped. But he was curious too, and he was determined to prove me wrong. We made our way through the forest, the trees looming over us like silent sentinels. The air felt oppressive, thick with an unspoken tension. As we neared the temple, I could feel my heart racing, my breath coming in short gasps. The chanting was already beginning, distant but growing louder. When we reached the temple, the sight of it made my stomach drop all over again. The stone structure was even more imposing in daylight, its carving sharper, its shadows darker. There was no mistaking it now. It was real. Mark hesitated, glancing around nervously. "Maybe we should go back," he muttered, his voice trembling. But before I could respond, the chanting stopped. The air became deathly still, and I felt the hairs on the back of my neck stand on end. And then they appeared. The figures in robes stepped out from the shadows, just as I had seen them before. But this time, they weren't chanting. They were waiting for us. I wanted to run, but I couldn't move. My legs felt like they were made of stone, frozen in place by some unseen force. The leader of the cult, the one who had turned toward me that night, stepped forward, its face just as pale and hollow as I remembered. "You should not have come," it said, its voice low and rasping. "But now you will see." Before I could react, the ground beneath me shifted. The stone altar began to glow, and the symbols etched into the floor began to pulse with an otherworldly light. The chanting resumed, louder than ever, as the cult members gathered in a circle around us, their voices blending together in a horrific harmony. And then, something happened that I will never forget. The sky above us darkened, the clouds swirling together as if they were alive. The earth trembled, and the very air seemed to hum with power. A shadow descended from the sky, taking shape above the altar, a figure so immense that it blotted out the stars. Its eyes were glowing red, burning with an ancient malice. This wasn't just a cult. It wasn't just a ritual. They had summoned something that had been waiting for centuries. Mark screamed beside me, but his voice was drowned out by the growing roar of the shadow. The ground cracked open, and the air became thick with the scent of burning flesh and sulfur. And as I looked into the burning eyes of the creature, I understood. There was no escape. The hollow temple had claimed us, and there was no going back. I never returned to town. Mark is gone, and I can't shake the feeling that they're still out there, waiting for anyone who dares to stumble upon their temple, ready to draw them into the darkness. I only wish I had stayed away. It's said that once a town's darkness is buried deep enough, it finds a way to claw its way back into the light. Sometimes it's a whisper on the wind, an old legend passed between generations. Other times, it's something far more sinister that rises from the depths of a forgotten history. I came to understand that truth when I moved to Pine Hill. Pine Hill was one of those quiet towns that you don't really notice unless you're looking for it. The kind of place where everyone knows everyone, and where every street corner has some whispered story attached to it. It seemed idyllic at first. Small houses, quiet streets, a single diner that always smelled like coffee and pancakes. But there was something unsettling about the town. I couldn't put my finger on it, but the longer I lived there, the more I began to sense something was wrong. I was 16 when we moved there. My dad had a job transfer, and my mom, tired of the chaos of city life, thought it was a good idea. Pine Hill was only a few hours outside of the city, and the change felt necessary, but not without a cost. We moved into a small house on the edge of town, a house that looked too pristine, too clean, like it had never been lived in, or like it was waiting for someone to arrive. On my first day of school, I tried to make friends. The kids were friendly, in their own way, but no one ever seemed to talk about anything that mattered. They talked about sports, their pets, and the weather, but when the conversation drifted to anything deeper, it was like a wall came up. And then there was the older crowd, the ones who didn't speak much, but who would always glance over at me with strange, knowing eyes. It wasn't long before I heard my first story about the town. One evening, after school, I was hanging out with a few of the older kids. There was Luke, a tall, broad-shouldered guy who liked to joke around, and his cousin, Emma, who had an eerie calm about her. It was Emma who first brought up the subject of the town's darker past. "You know about the Grove, right?" Emma asked. I shook my head. "What's that?" Luke gave her a quick look, and she smiled, almost as if she was amused by the question. "You really don't know?" she asked, as if it were some kind of joke. "It's just the oldest part of Pine Hill. No one goes there anymore. It's kind of forbidden." I felt a chill run down my spine. "Why?" I asked. Emma's smile faded. "Because of what happened there. A long time ago. People don't talk about it much anymore. But if you ask the right person, you might get an answer." That night, I couldn't stop thinking about what Emma had said. The Grove. What could be so dangerous about a place that the whole town seemed to avoid? I tried to forget it, but curiosity gnawed at me. The next day, I asked around. No one would tell me anything useful. People's eyes would go wide, or they'd laugh it off like it was nothing. It was like they were afraid to say anything at all. But I managed to find a map of the town and pinpoint the Grove. It was located just beyond the old cemetery, in the woods, deep enough that even the most daring kids refused to go. I was determined to see it for myself. One Saturday afternoon, when I knew no one would be around, I decided to go. I didn't tell anyone. No one in Pine Hill would have cared anyway. The walk wasn't long, but the woods around the Grove grew thick as I ventured deeper. The sunlight grew dimmer, and a strange stillness settled over the trees. It was like the world around me was holding its breath. When I reached the clearing, the sight of the Grove hit me like a punch to the gut. It was a large circle of ancient, twisted trees, their branches reaching up toward the sky like gnarled hands. The ground beneath them was marked with strange symbols carved into the earth, and in the center was a stone structure, an altar, though it looked like it hadn't been used in decades. It was a peaceful place, in an eerie way, but something felt wrong. The air felt colder here, heavier, as if the weight of centuries was pressing down on me. I stepped closer to the altar, my heart racing. As I leaned in, I saw something carved into the stone, a symbol I didn't recognize, but one that made my skin crawl. It was a circle, filled with intersecting lines, like a twisted wheel, and within its center, a symbol that looked disturbingly like an eye. Suddenly, the hair on the back of my neck stood up. I turned, half expecting someone to be standing behind me, but the clearing was still, the trees surrounding it dark and silent. I tried to shake off the unease creeping up on me, but something told me I wasn't alone. I was about to leave when I heard it, a low, guttural sound, almost like chanting, but more like a hum vibrating through the earth itself. I froze. The air seemed to shimmer with energy, and I felt my chest tighten. The sound wasn't loud, but it was all around me, and it wasn't coming from any person. It was coming from the ground itself. And then I saw them. Figures emerged from the woods, stepping into the clearing one by one. They were dressed in dark, flowing robes, their faces hidden behind masks. The masks were wooden, carved with strange symbols, and they stared at me with hollow eyes. My heart began to race, and before I could move, I heard a voice. "Leave," it said, low and stern. "You don't belong here." I spun around, but there was nowhere to run. The figures were all around me now, their movements slow but deliberate. I wanted to scream, to ask what they wanted, but the words stuck in my throat. There was something in the air, something ancient and powerful that made it impossible to speak. "You've seen too much," the voice continued. "You know too much." I backed away slowly, my feet stumbling on the uneven ground. The chanting grew louder, and the air around me seemed to crackle with energy. The figures began to circle around the altar, their hands raised toward the sky, as if summoning something. Something dark. Something that had been waiting for a long time. I knew I needed to leave, but my legs wouldn't move. My body felt heavy, like the weight of the entire forest was pressing down on me. And then, as the figures continued their chant, I felt something. Something cold, something ancient, stir within the earth beneath me. The ground cracked open, and out of the fissure rose a form that made my blood freeze in my veins. It wasn't human. It wasn't even alive in the way I understood it. The creature was tall, its form shifting like a mass of shadow and smoke. Its eyes, glowing an unnatural red, locked onto me, and I felt my breath catch in my throat. It was the thing that had been waiting, the thing the cult had been summoning, and it was angry that I had witnessed it. "Run!" A voice screamed, breaking through the fog in my mind. It was Emma. Her face flashed before my eyes, and I realized that the cult had been watching me all along. They had seen me come to the grove, and they had allowed it. They wanted me to witness the ritual, to witness the awakening. I turned and ran, my legs moving on instinct. The chanting continued, but it sounded more like a distant roar, like the earth itself was coming alive. I stumbled through the woods, branches scraping at my skin, but I didn't stop. I couldn't stop. The creature was following me, its presence darkening the very air around me. I made it back to town, breathless and shaken, but I knew something had changed. The people in Pine Hill were no longer the same. They looked at me with knowing eyes, and I could feel their gaze following me wherever I went. The grove had taken something from me, something I couldn't explain. I never went back, and I tried to tell my parents, but they didn't understand. They told me it was just a nightmare, a figment of my imagination. But I know the truth. The cult is real, the rite is real, and the grove is still there, waiting for someone else to stumble across it, to witness its awakening. And next time, they won't let you leave. Now, every time I close my eyes, I can still hear the chanting. It's there, deep in the back of my mind, calling to me. The cult is watching, waiting for the next one to come to the grove. And I know, deep down, that it will be me. I'll be their next offering, or worse, their next sacrifice. I was never the kind of person to believe in ghost stories, cults, or anything supernatural. I always thought people got caught up in their own imaginations or spread rumors for fun. But after what happened to me, I'm not so sure anymore. Now, I can't even walk through the woods at night without feeling the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. I'll never forget the night I stumbled upon something I couldn't explain, something dark and terrifying. It all started when my family moved to a rural town called Black Hollow. The town was small, tiny, even, and seemed like the kind of place where everyone knew everyone else. My parents, tired of the city life, decided it was time for a change, and so we packed up and moved to Black Hollow. I was 17 at the time, a little bitter about leaving behind my friends and the familiarity of the city, but I had no choice. The first few weeks were uneventful. We lived in an old farmhouse on the outskirts of the town. It was a peaceful place, tucked away from the hustle and bustle of city life. But there was something odd about the place. It wasn't the house itself, though it creaked and groaned at night, like it had a life of its own. No, it was the way people acted when we first arrived. At first, it seemed like everyone in town was friendly enough, always waving as we drove by, always stopping to chat when we went to the market. But there was something in their eyes that made me uneasy. They always looked sad, like something had been lost long ago, and they were still mourning it. I noticed it especially in the older folks, those who had lived in Black Hollow their whole lives. They never talked about the past, never mentioned what had happened before. They would look at me with their tired eyes, smile faintly, and quickly change the subject. I overheard bits and pieces from the younger people, two mutterings about the town's history, about the old ways and the rituals, but no one would tell me anything outright. It was like they all shared some unspoken secret. And then, one day, I found out what it was. It started with a group of kids at school. They were older than me, maybe a couple of years ahead, but we had some mutual friends. They seemed normal at first, but one afternoon, they invited me to hang out. I wasn't really sure about it, but I went anyway. We all ended up walking to the woods near the edge of town. I should have known something was off when they insisted on going deeper into the trees than I had ever been. The forest was dense, and the deeper we walked, the darker it became, even though it was still early afternoon. "We're going to the hollow," one of the guys, Mark, said as we walked along the narrow path. "Ever been there?" I shook my head, feeling a strange twinge of anxiety. "The hollow is where everything happens," he said, almost like he was trying to convince himself as much as me. "You'll see. It's different." The hollow was a small clearing in the woods, surrounded by towering trees. At first glance, it seemed peaceful, maybe even serene. There were piles of rocks scattered throughout, and old, rotting logs lay in disarray on the ground. It wasn't until I looked more closely that I noticed something disturbing. In the center of the clearing was a circle of stones, carefully arranged, as if they were marking some kind of boundary. And scattered around the stones were small objects, pieces of string, old candles, and even bits of cloth, as though someone had left offerings. The ground itself was uneven, like it had been disturbed recently. Mark and the others gathered around the circle, and I hung back, feeling uneasy. I hadn't been told about this part of the forest, and I wasn't sure I wanted to know. But the others didn't seem bothered by it. They were laughing, talking, as if this was just another spot to hang out. Then, Mark turned to me with a grin. "You don't know, do you? You've never heard of the silent worshippers?" I frowned, unsure of what he meant. "What are you talking about?" Mark's grin faded. He looked around at the others, then lowered his voice. "The silent worshippers are the ones who used to come here, long before any of us were born. They worshipped something in the woods, something ancient. The elders of the town used to be a part of it." I took a step back. "You're kidding, right? This is just some old folklore, right?" But Mark's face was serious now, his eyes gleaming in a way that made me uncomfortable. "You're not supposed to know about it," he whispered. "They don't want anyone to remember. But it's all still here, in the forest, in the ground. There are still people who follow the old ways, people who still worship in secret." I felt a shiver run down my spine. This wasn't a joke anymore. Something was wrong here. The next few days were a blur of unease. I couldn't stop thinking about the hollow, about the silent worshippers, and about what Mark had said. It felt like I had stumbled onto something I wasn't supposed to know, and every time I saw the older folks in town, their sad eyes seemed to be watching me. I could feel them whispering behind my back, warning each other about me. But the worst part was the dreams. I had always been a sound sleeper, but after that day in the woods, I started having these vivid dreams. In the dreams, I was walking through the forest again, deeper than before. The trees would whisper to me, their branches creaking in the wind. I'd hear chanting, soft, distant chanting, and see the figure of a person standing in the distance, their face hidden beneath a hood. One night, I woke up drenched in sweat, my heart pounding. The chanting still echoed in my ears, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. I went downstairs to get a glass of water, but when I passed by the living room window, I froze. There, in the yard, were figures, dark shapes standing in the shadows. At first, I thought it was just my imagination, but as I watched, I realized they were moving. They weren't standing still. They were walking, slowly, toward the woods. My breath caught in my throat as I fumbled for the light. By the time I looked back, the figures were gone. The next day, I went into town and found myself drawn to the old church. It was a large, Gothic building, weathered by time, but still standing tall at the edge of the town. The door creaked as I pushed it open, and I stepped inside, the cool air greeting me. The church was empty, the pews silent. I walked toward the front, where an old pulpit stood. There was something unsettling about it, something I couldn't put my finger on. The walls were lined with old paintings, portraits of people I didn't recognize, but their eyes seemed to follow me as I moved through the room. As I reached the pulpit, I saw something strange on the floor, a symbol carved into the wood. It was the same symbol I had seen in the hollow, the same one that had appeared in my dreams. It was unmistakable. Just as I was about to turn and leave, I heard a sound behind me, soft, but unmistakable. A whisper. I spun around, but there was no one there. I was alone, but the feeling of being watched was overwhelming. That's when I saw it. A figure in the shadows, standing just outside the doorway of the church. It was cloaked in black, the face hidden, but I could feel its eyes on me. I tried to move, but my feet felt glued to the floor. I couldn't breathe. And then, just as quickly as it had appeared, the figure vanished. I never went back to the church. I never went back to the woods. I couldn't. After that night, everything seemed to fall apart. I stopped seeing my friends, stopped going to school. I couldn't shake the feeling that the silent worshippers were always watching me, waiting for me to return to the hollow. I never did, but every now and then, I can still hear the chanting in my dreams. It's soft, distant, like it's calling me. And every time I wake up, I can't shake the feeling that they're out there, waiting. And I know, deep down, that it's only a matter of time before they find me. I had always been a skeptic when it came to supernatural stories, ghost tales, and the like. I mean, sure, I'd listen to my friends' wild stories around a campfire, but deep down, I never truly believed in anything otherworldly. That is, until I moved to Ravenbrook. Ravenbrook is the kind of place you don't notice when you drive through, tucked away in the hills, surrounded by dense forest. It looked like any small, quiet town. It wasn't big, just a few streets, a couple of shops, and a handful of families living in modest homes. But as soon as my family moved there, I knew something was different. I was 16 when we moved. My dad had gotten a job offer at a local firm, and we needed a change, so we packed up and left the city. I was hesitant at first, but I thought maybe this would be a good opportunity to start fresh. However, it didn't take long for me to realize that Ravenbrook was hiding something. It wasn't the kind of place where you'd stumble across things in plain sight. It was a place where the town's dark secrets lurked just beneath the surface, waiting for someone to dig too deep. I first noticed something was off when I met Sam, a quiet kid who seemed to appear out of nowhere when I was hanging out at the local park one afternoon. He was about my age, tall with dark hair and a brooding expression that made him seem more mature than he actually was. He sat on the bench next to me without a word, just staring out into the distance as if waiting for something. I was a bit curious, so I decided to strike up a conversation. "You new here?" I asked. He nodded slowly. "Yeah, just moved here a few weeks ago." I could tell that Sam was one of those kids who didn't want to talk too much, so I let him be. But something about his demeanor made me uneasy, like he knew more about the town than he was letting on. After a few moments of silence, Sam suddenly turned to me, his eyes narrow. "You've heard of the Midnight Circle, right?" I froze. What? The Midnight Circle, he repeated, his voice almost a whisper. It's a group that's been around for as long as anyone can remember. People don't talk about it much. They try to hide it, but it's real, and you shouldn't mess with it. I was skeptical, of course. Midnight Circle? It sounded like something out of a horror movie, but something about Sam's tone, the seriousness in his voice, made me stop and listen. What do you mean? I asked. Sam looked around nervously, then leaned in closer. I'm not supposed to be telling you this, he whispered, but if you're new here, you should know that there's a ritual they perform every year. It's called the Gathering. My curiosity was piqued. What kind of ritual? Sam's face grew even darker. The kind you don't want to know about. Trust me, it's not something anyone should mess with. Just stay away from the woods after dark, and you'll be fine. I didn't press him any further, but the idea of a secret ritual happening in the woods, especially one that made Sam so uneasy, lingered in my mind. Over the next few days, I tried to ask more people around town about it, but every time I did, people clammed up. It was like the Midnight Circle was some kind of taboo, an unspoken subject no one wanted to discuss. A week later, something strange happened. I was walking home from school, taking my usual shortcut through the woods that bordered the edge of the town. It wasn't uncommon to see old, abandoned houses or overgrown paths there, but this time, something was different. As I walked deeper into the trees, I felt like I was being watched. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up. I kept walking, trying to ignore the growing unease in my stomach. That's when I saw it, a clearing up ahead. At first, I thought it was just another empty spot in the woods, but as I got closer, I noticed something that made my heart race. The trees around the clearing were arranged in a perfect circle, and in the center of the clearing was an altar made of stone, covered in strange symbols, as if someone had carved them there recently. It looked too out of place to be natural. I stepped closer, trying to see what was carved into the stone. I could barely make out some words, but they were written in a language I didn't recognize. There were also strange markings, almost like animal tracks, leading into the woods in various directions. I was about to turn and leave when I heard something that stopped me cold. A rustling sound from behind me. I spun around, my heart pounding in my chest, but the clearing was empty. I looked around, half expecting to see someone watching me from the trees, but there was nothing, just the eerie silence of the forest. My mind raced with questions. What had happened here? Why did the place feel so wrong? I couldn't get the image of the clearing out of my head. It was like a magnetic pull that kept drawing me back. I started to research the town's history, trying to dig up any information about this Midnight Circle or the ritual Sam had mentioned. But every time I tried to ask someone directly, I was met with strange, cryptic responses. The older folks in town, especially, seemed to get nervous when I mentioned anything about the woods or the gathering. It wasn't until I met Sarah, an older girl who worked at the local diner, that I finally got a real answer. One evening, after a long shift, Sarah pulled me aside while I was waiting for my parents to pick me up. She was in her late 20s, and she had an air of someone who had seen far too much to be naive anymore. "You've been asking about the Midnight Circle, haven't you?" she asked quietly, as if afraid someone might overhear. I nodded. She sighed, glancing around before pulling me closer. "It's not something you want to get involved in. The gathering isn't a story or a legend. It's real. Every year, the members of the circle gather in the woods and perform a ritual to, well, I don't really know exactly what they're doing, but it's dangerous. It's old, and it's something no one outside of the circle should see." My heart raced. "What happens during this ritual?" Sarah hesitated for a moment, her eyes flicking to the door, then back to me. "I'm not supposed to tell you this, but they summon something. Some say it's an ancient spirit, others think it's something darker. But whatever it is, it's been going on for generations, and no one in town can stop it." I swallowed hard, trying to process what she was saying. Why does the town allow it to happen? Sarah's expression darkened. Because the circle has power. They've always had power. They control things, people, even. They make sure the town stays quiet, that people don't ask too many questions. If anyone tries to expose them, bad things happen. Trust me, you don't want to get involved. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept replaying everything Sarah had said in my head. The midnight circle, the ritual, the whispers about the power they held. It was all too much to ignore. And yet, despite all the warnings, a part of me couldn't shake the feeling that I needed to know more. I needed to understand what was happening in the woods. The next evening, under the cover of darkness, I ventured back into the forest. I was determined to uncover the truth, even if it meant risking everything. The woods were eerily quiet as I made my way to the clearing. My heart pounded in my chest as I reached the familiar spot, and I could see the stone altar in the distance. But this time, it wasn't empty. Figures, cloaked in dark robes, were gathered around the altar, chanting in low voices. The air felt thick, heavy with energy, and I could feel the ground vibrating beneath my feet. I stepped back, trying to stay hidden behind the trees, but one of the figures seemed to turn in my direction. For a brief moment, I caught sight of their face, a face that wasn't human. It was pale, gaunt, with eyes that glowed like embers. A chill ran through my entire body, and I had never been more terrified in my life. The chanting grew louder, more frantic, and that's when I saw it. Something was rising from the altar, a dark figure shaped like a shadow, with eyes that burned with an unholy fire. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't move. It was as if my body had frozen in place, trapped by the force of what was happening before me. I don't remember how I managed to get back home that night. I only know that I didn't sleep. I couldn't. The image of that creature, the thing they summoned, haunted me, and the chanting still echoed in my ears. After that night, I knew I couldn't stay in Ravenbrook any longer. I tried to tell my parents, but they wouldn't listen. They were just as under the circle's influence as everyone else. I left as soon as I could, but the memories never left me. Every night, when the moon is full, I hear the chanting again, faint but unmistakable. And sometimes, just sometimes, I can feel that dark presence following me, waiting for me to return. I've never been the type to believe in conspiracy theories or dark secrets hidden in small towns. I've always chalked up eerie feelings and strange occurrences to overactive imaginations or simple coincidence. But after everything that happened to me in the small town of Hollow Creek, I can't deny that there are forces in this world beyond our comprehension. The kind of forces that only the bravest or most foolish people seek. Forces that exist not only in the shadows, but in the very heart of those around you. I was just a teenager, 17 years old, when my family moved to Hollow Creek. My dad, a small-town country boy, had always dreamed of returning to his roots. He wanted the slower pace of life, the clean air, and the tight-knit community. My mom, on the other hand, was reluctantly along for the ride, and I had no say in the matter. The day we pulled up to our new house was an overcast one, clouds hanging low in the sky like an omen. The house was a modest two-story cottage with a wraparound porch and a view of the nearby woods. It looked old, weathered, but I didn't mind it at first. It wasn't long, though, before I began noticing things. Little things at first. People's strange behavior, hushed conversations, the way the older residents would look away when we passed them on the street. There was something in the air, a kind of unspoken tension, like everyone was hiding something, but no one would ever tell us what. My curiosity grew, and eventually, I started digging for answers. The first person to give me any real information was Emily, a girl my age who lived a few houses down. She had pale skin, almost unnaturally so, and her eyes always seemed distant, like she was somewhere else in her mind. She seemed nice enough, though. We quickly became friends, bonding over our shared sense of being outsiders in a town that seemed to hold its breath when we walked by. One evening, after school, Emily invited me over to her house. Her parents were away, and we spent the afternoon talking about life in Hollow Creek, which was more complicated than I'd originally thought. "You're not from around here, are you?" she asked as we sat on her porch swing, sipping soda. "No, just moved here a few weeks ago. My dad's really into the whole country living thing." Emily nodded thoughtfully, her eyes scanning the horizon as though she was watching something only she could see. "It's different here. People like to keep to themselves. They always have." I raised an eyebrow. "What do you mean? Is there something wrong with this place?" She hesitated before answering, her voice quiet and cautious. There's a lot of history here, and some things should be left alone. At first, I thought she was just being melodramatic, as teenagers often are. But when I pressed her for more details, she grew even more cryptic. There's an old oak tree in the forest, not far from the edge of town. The fallen oak. It's the site of the ritual. I frowned. The ritual? Emily looked at me seriously, her pale face tightening with fear. The people here, they don't talk about it, but they've been performing it for generations. It's something the town does every year, and if you're not careful, you can get pulled into it, like my family did. Later that evening, I couldn't shake what Emily had said. The fallen oak? The ritual? What was she talking about? Was she just telling ghost stories? Or was there something darker going on in this quiet little town? I decided to do some digging. The next day, I went to the town library, hoping to find anything, about the so-called ritual. The librarian, a frail old woman with gray hair and tired eyes, barely looked up from her desk as I searched through the dusty bookshelves. But when I asked her about the ritual of the fallen oak, her face drained of color. The ritual, she repeated, her voice barely above a whisper. That's not something you should be asking about. Why? What is it? I pressed. The librarian lowered her voice even further, glancing around the room as though checking to make sure no one else was listening. It's an old tradition, one that has been passed down through the generations. It's been kept secret, but there are some in town who still practice it. Practice what? I asked, my pulse quickening with anticipation. The librarian swallowed hard, her gaze darting nervously toward the windows. They call it a ritual of renewal, or sacrifice. It's not something you want to know about. Before I could ask any more questions, the librarian hurriedly shushed me and waved me away. It was clear she wanted nothing more than to get rid of me. I left the library with more questions than answers and a feeling that the town's dark secrets were slowly closing in on me. I spent the following days trying to avoid the topic, but the sense of dread only grew stronger. It felt as if something was watching me, waiting for me to make a mistake. Emily continued to be distant, giving me cryptic hints but never offering real answers. Then, one evening, she called me. "I think it's time you knew," she said, her voice shaking with fear. "The ritual, it happens soon. You have to be careful. You don't want to get involved." "Why?" I asked. "What's going to happen?" "You won't be able to stop it once it starts. Trust me." Emily's voice broke. I saw it last year. I was part of it, without even knowing. My family, they're all part of it. Her words haunted me for days. I could feel the air around me thickening, the silence of the town pressing in from all sides. The fallen oak was real, and whatever happened there, whatever ritual was performed, had begun to consume everything. The night of the ritual arrived. It was a cold, moonless night, the sky a blanket of blackness dotted with distant stars. Emily had warned me to stay inside, to not venture out after dark, but I couldn't ignore the pull anymore. I had to know the truth. I had to see what happened at the fallen oak. I left my house quietly, creeping through the back door and into the woods behind our property. The trees loomed overhead, their branches twisting like skeletal fingers. As I made my way toward the clearing, the sound of chanting reached my ears. The rhythmic hum of voices sent a chill down my spine. I stumbled upon the clearing and froze in place. There, beneath the massive fallen oak, stood a circle of people, all dressed in dark robes. Their faces were hidden beneath hoods, but I could feel their eyes on me, even from a distance. The chanting grew louder, more intense, and in the center of the circle was a figure, someone lying motionless on the ground. A sacrifice. My heart pounded in my chest as I stepped back, trying to remain hidden behind the trees. But as I watched, something strange began to happen. The ground trembled beneath my feet, and a cold wind swept through the clearing, rustling the leaves. The figure on the ground began to rise. It was as though the earth itself was giving birth to something dark, something ancient. The figure, now standing, cloaked in shadows, turned slowly, its face still hidden. And as it moved, I could hear whispers, voices that seemed to come from the very air around me. The townspeople raised their arms in unison, their chanting reaching a fever pitch. The ground cracked open beneath them, and from the depths of the earth, something emerged. It was a dark, formless entity, its presence suffocating, as though the very air was being drained of life. I couldn't breathe. My head spun, and then, in a voice that shook the very earth, the entity spoke. Renewal, it said. Sacrifice. It was a voice that reverberated in my bones, a voice that seemed to call to me from beyond the veil of reality. I don't remember how I escaped that night. I only know that I ran. I ran until my legs couldn't carry me anymore, until my lungs burned with every breath. But no matter how far I ran, I could still hear the chanting, the whispers, the cold, oppressive feeling of something following me. I left Hollow Creek the next day. My parents never asked where I went or why I was so shaken. The town's grip on me had loosened, but it would never fully let go. I don't know how long the ritual of the fallen oak has been happening, but I do know one thing. There are things in this world that are far older and darker than we can understand. And sometimes, the only way to survive is to run and never look back. But even now, all these years later, I still hear the chanting in my dreams. I still feel the cold presence that followed me through the woods. I wonder if it's waiting for me to return. And every time I hear the wind howling through the trees, I wonder if the ritual is still going on. It's strange how a simple, innocent move to a new town can unravel so many dark secrets. I used to think that things like sinister cults and old, bloodthirsty rituals were the stuff of movies or urban legends. That was until I moved to Ashford Hollow. My name is Matt, and I was 17 years old when my family moved to Ashford Hollow, a small town nestled between hills and thick forests. The town had an old charm to it. Cobblestone streets, century-old buildings, and a town square that looked like it was stuck in the past. It was the kind of place people rarely left, and those who lived there rarely spoke about their lives outside of it. At first, I thought it was just the country lifestyle, but the longer I stayed there, the more I realized something was off. Something very dark was buried in the town's history, and soon, I was about to uncover it. It all started when I met Lily. She was a strange girl, quiet and withdrawn, but there was something intriguing about her. She had pale skin, almost translucent, and always seemed to be staring off into the distance, as though she could see something the rest of us couldn't. She wore an old, faded black dress that made her look like she had stepped out of another time. We met at school on my first day. I was trying to navigate my way through the strange halls when she appeared beside me. "You're new here," she said, her voice soft and distant, like she was speaking from far away. "Yeah, just moved here. Name's Matt." She gave me a small, unreadable smile. "I'm Lily. You'll find that the town doesn't change much. People don't leave, and no one really talks to strangers." I chuckled nervously. "Yeah, I've noticed that." Lily didn't respond right away. Instead, she glanced at the door and then back at me. "You shouldn't get too close to the old woods near town," she said suddenly. I raised an eyebrow. "Why?" "I've been thinking about going for a walk there. It looks like the perfect place to clear my head." She looked at me with a serious expression, her eyes locking onto mine with an intensity one wasn't expecting. "Don't. There are things in those woods, things you don't want to find. Trust me." I laughed awkwardly, brushing off the weirdness of the conversation. "It's just woods, Lily. I'm sure it's harmless." But she didn't laugh with me. Her face remained stoic, almost fearful, as though warning me about something far more dangerous than a walk in the woods. That evening, I couldn't stop thinking about Lily's warning. Was she just being paranoid? Or was there something about this town that I didn't know? I decided I had to find out for myself. The next day after school, I made my way to the old woods. The sun was beginning to set, and the trees stretched high into the sky, their branches twisting like skeletal fingers. The further I walked, the quieter the world seemed to get. It was as if the air itself was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. As I ventured deeper, I came across an old stone path, hidden beneath the overgrown vines. My curiosity got the best of me, and I followed it. The path led me to a clearing, and in the center stood a large, twisted oak tree. Its gnarled roots spread across the ground like arms reaching for the earth. and its bark was scarred with strange symbols, carved deeply into the wood. I didn't know what I was looking at, but I could feel that this place was wrong. There was a weight in the air, something oppressive, something ancient. I stood there for what felt like an eternity, my heart pounding in my chest, before I heard a noise behind me, a rustling in the leaves. I spun around, but no one was there. The wind howled, and the trees creaked, as if warning me to leave. But it was too late. As I turned to walk back, something caught my eye. A figure, dressed in dark robes, emerged from the shadows of the trees. I froze, my breath caught in my throat. The figure stepped closer, revealing a face hidden beneath the hood. The eyes, cold and lifeless, locked onto mine. The figure didn't say anything, just continued to stare at me. Then, without a word, it turned and disappeared into the trees. That night, I couldn't shake the feeling that I had uncovered something I wasn't supposed to see. I decided to talk to Lily the next day. Maybe she knew more about what was going on in those woods. I found her at lunch, sitting alone as usual. She looked up as I approached. "I went to the woods," I said, sitting across from her. Her eyes widened, and her face paled. "You shouldn't have gone there." I saw something, a figure. It was wearing dark robes, and Lily cut me off, her voice trembling. "You saw one of them. The cult of the hollow oak." I stared at her in confusion. "What's that?" She swallowed hard, glancing nervously around the lunchroom. "It's a secret society that's been in Ashford Hollow for centuries. They call themselves the cult of the hollow oak because they believe that the tree in the woods is sacred. They worship something ancient, something evil." My stomach twisted at the mention of the word evil, but I pushed her to explain further. "What do they do? Why are they so secretive about it?" Lily leaned in closer, her voice barely above a whisper. "They perform rituals every year under the full moon. They believe that by offering sacrifices, blood sacrifices, they can keep the hollow oak alive. The oak is the source of their power. It's a gateway, a portal, and every year they need to feed it." I stared at her, horrified. "Sacrifices? You mean people?" Lily nodded solemnly. "Yes, people. But they don't just take anyone. They wait for the right person, the one who is chosen." I felt a cold shiver run down my spine. "Have you been chosen?" Lily's face darkened. "I thought I was. I thought I would be the one they chose last year. But it wasn't me. It was someone else." The following days were a blur of confusion and fear. Lily didn't talk to me much after that conversation. She seemed more withdrawn than usual, like she was lost in her own thoughts. I wanted to help her, but I had no idea how. Then, one night, just as I was beginning to let go of the fear, I heard something outside my window. A soft whispering. At first, I thought it was the wind, but the whispers grew louder, almost beckoning me to listen. I opened the window and looked out into the darkness. There, in the distance, I saw them. Figures, draped in dark robes, standing in a circle around the hollow oak. The same symbol I had seen carved into its bark was glowing faintly under the moonlight. And in the center of the circle was another figure, someone who appeared to be tied to the ground, unable to move. I didn't know what to do. The town was silent, unaware of the horrors unfolding just beyond its edges. I ran to the woods, determined to stop whatever was happening. But when I arrived, I found that the clearing was empty. There was no one there, no signs of a ritual, just the same eerie silence. But when I touched the bark of the hollow oak, I felt it. A pulse, a heartbeat, and then a voice. "You are too late." The next morning, I woke up to news that shook me to my core. Lily was gone. The police couldn't find her, and no one seemed to know where she had gone. It was as if she had vanished off the face of the earth. I knew in my gut what had happened. The cult of the hollow oak had taken her, just as they had taken others before her. I tried to tell the authorities, but they didn't believe me. They chalked it up to a runaway teen. But deep down, I knew better. They were protecting something far darker than they were willing to admit. The town had been involved for years, complicit in the rituals, in the sacrifices. The cult of the hollow oak had its hooks in Ashford Hollow, and they weren't going to let anyone escape. It's been years since that night, and I still can't escape the memory of what happened to Lily. I left Ashford Hollow shortly after, but the town is always with me, lingering in my dreams. The whispers, the chanting, the cold touch of the hollow oak. I often wonder if Lily is still out there, if she's become a part of something far darker than I could ever understand. And I wonder if the hollow oak is still waiting for its next offering, still pulsing with life, still feeding on the sacrifices that keep it alive. Some things, once unleashed, can never be undone. My name is Rachel, and I've never been the same since the summer I spent in Westbrook. It's funny how quickly the feeling of safety can be replaced by something darker, something twisted. You think you know the people around you, the places you visit, and the paths you walk, but sometimes the truth is more horrifying than you could ever imagine. I wasn't prepared for what I found that summer, and I know I'll never forget it. Westbrook wasn't much of a town. Small, quiet, tucked away behind thick forests and old stone houses. Most people would drive through without a second glance, but there was something different about it, a secret lurking beneath its peaceful exterior. I don't know why I didn't pick up on it sooner. Maybe I was too young, or maybe I was just too trusting. It was the summer before my senior year of high school when my family decided to visit my aunt and uncle, who had recently moved to Westbrook. They had bought a charming house on the edge of town, surrounded by fields and old trees. The house itself was beautiful, old but well kept, and I remember how the sunlight filtered through the trees during the afternoons, casting long shadows on the ground. It looked like the perfect place to spend a relaxing summer, but it didn't take long for me to sense that something was off. It started the first night I was there. My aunt and uncle had been very welcoming, and everything seemed fine at first. We had a family dinner, and I was excited to spend time with my cousins, Anna and Ben. But after dinner, as I was getting ready for bed, I overheard something strange. My aunt and uncle were in the living room, speaking in hushed tones. I couldn't hear everything, but there was one thing that stuck with me. The mention of the Crimson Circle. At first, I didn't think much of it. It sounded like some old family tradition or a local gathering, but something about the way they said it made my skin crawl. There was fear in their voices, real, raw fear. The next day, I decided to ask my aunt about it. "Aunt Claire," I said, sitting across from her at breakfast, "what's the Crimson Circle? I overheard you and Uncle Luke talking about it last night." Her face went pale, and for a moment, I thought she might faint. She quickly set her cup down, and her eyes darted to the window, as though making sure no one was listening. "It's nothing, sweetheart," she said, her voice too calm. "Just an old legend from the town. People talk about it, but it's nothing you need to worry about." But I could tell she was lying, and when I pressed her further, she grew even more agitated, telling me to forget about it and not ask any more questions. But of course, I didn't listen. The more I explored Westbrook, the more I uncovered. It wasn't just the Crimson Circle that had my attention. It was the way the town felt. People were polite but distant. They didn't seem to want to get too close to anyone. I tried to make friends with some of the local teens, but they always gave me weird looks, as though I didn't belong. One day, I decided to take a walk through the woods behind my aunt's house. I loved the peaceful solitude, the way the trees whispered in the wind. But as I ventured deeper into the forest, I stumbled across something I wasn't supposed to see. There was a clearing in the woods, a small open space where the trees parted to reveal a circle of stone markers. At first, I thought it was just an old ritual site, abandoned long ago. But as I walked closer, I saw something that made my blood run cold. Red stains covered the stones. It wasn't just dirt or moss, it was blood. Old, dried blood. I stepped back in horror, my heart racing. I had no idea what I had stumbled upon, but something told me it wasn't something I should have seen. I turned to leave, but then I noticed something even more unsettling. A symbol was carved into one of the stones, a circle with a triangle inside, surrounded by strange, indecipherable runes. I had seen that symbol before, on a pendant my aunt wore. That night, I couldn't sleep. The image of the blood-stained stones haunted me. What was the Crimson Circle? And why did it feel like I was being pulled into something far darker than I had ever imagined? The next day, I confronted my aunt again. I had to know the truth. "Aunt Claire, what is this? What's going on in this town?" Her face went ashen. She tried to dismiss me, saying it was all just superstition, but I could tell she was terrified. Finally, after much prodding, she whispered, "The Crimson Circle isn't just a legend. It's a cult, a group of people who believe in an ancient power that resides in the land. They believe that through blood sacrifices, they can tap into that power, granting them immortality and control over the town." My heart stopped. Blood sacrifices? You mean real sacrifices? Aunt Claire nodded gravely. "It's been going on for centuries, Rachel. The town, the land, they have a bond. The Crimson Circle has been part of it for as long as anyone can remember. The town gives them what they need, and in return, the town is protected. But what does it mean for us? For me and my family?" I asked, my voice shaking. "It means," she said, looking me in the eye, "that you are part of it now. The moment you set foot in Westbrook, you became part of their plan." I didn't understand at first. How could something so horrific be real? But everything in the town seemed to point back to the Crimson Circle. The strange behavior of the locals, the warnings to stay away from certain places, the odd rituals that were whispered about at night. I had no choice but to confront my uncle. When I found him in the study later that evening, I demanded the truth. He didn't say anything at first, just stared at the floor as though he was ashamed. "It's been happening for generations, Rachel," he said quietly. "Our family has always been part of it. We weren't supposed to leave, but we did. We thought we could escape, but there's no escaping it." I felt a chill run down my spine. "What do they want from us?" "Your blood," he whispered, looking over his shoulder as though the walls were listening. "They want your blood. They need the blood of someone who is tied to the land. It's how the power is transferred, how the ritual is completed. Why didn't you tell me?" I asked, my voice trembling with fear and anger. "Why didn't you warn me?" "We thought you would never come," he said, his eyes haunted. "We thought we could keep it hidden from you. But the moment you set foot in this town, the moment you walked into the woods, they knew. They've been watching you." That night, I couldn't sleep. My thoughts raced as I lay in the dark, listening to the sounds of the house settling. But then, just as I was beginning to drift off, I heard it. A low, guttural chanting coming from outside. My heart leapt into my throat. I slipped out of bed and crept to the window. What I saw made my blood run cold. A group of people, draped in dark robes, gathered in the clearing near the woods. They stood in a perfect circle, their hands raised to the sky as if summoning something from the earth. In the center of the circle was a small stone altar, and I could see that it was stained red with blood. My heart pounded in my chest as I realized what was happening. The Crimson Circle was performing a ritual, and I was the sacrifice. I ran. I didn't think, I just ran. My feet carried me through the house, down the stairs, and out into the night. The sound of chanting grew louder, and I could hear the rustling of footsteps behind me. But I didn't stop. I couldn't. I ran all the way to the woods, hoping to outrun the horror that was chasing me. But as I entered the clearing, I saw them. The robed figures. The cult. And standing in the center of the circle was my aunt and uncle, their faces twisted in fear. "You can't escape," one of the figures said, his voice low and menacing. "The ritual is complete." I don't know how long I was unconscious, but when I woke up, I was lying in the clearing, the sun barely rising above the trees. The chanting had stopped, but the air felt thick with something I couldn't describe. I ran back to the house and never looked back. My family was gone. The house was empty, as if they had never existed. And Westbrook? It was like it had never been there at all. I don't know what the Crimson Circle wanted with me or why they chose me that night, but I do know this. I never should have gone to that town. And now, even years later, the sound of chanting haunts me in my dreams. The Crimson Circle is out there, and I have no doubt they'll come for me again. Because once you become part of their ritual, there's no escape. The night was always quiet in the small town of Carrington Falls. It was the kind of place where nothing ever happened, where everyone knew everyone else, and the most exciting thing to look forward to was the annual Harvest Festival. That was the way it had always been, until that fateful summer. I was just 18 when I moved to Carrington Falls, seeking refuge from the chaos of city life and trying to find some peace. Little did I know, that peace was the calm before a storm of darkness. I'm Jared, and this is the story of how I learned that some secrets are better left undiscovered. It all began when I first moved into the house on Elm Street. It was a quaint, old cottage that had seen better days, but it was affordable and far from the bustle of city life. I thought it would be the perfect place to start fresh. The town, with its creaky sidewalks and narrow streets, had a certain charm that felt like something out of an old movie. The locals were kind enough, though their smiles always seemed a bit too tight, as if they were hiding something. One of the first people I met was a girl named Olivia. She was around my age, with long brown hair and soft green eyes. She lived down the street and often came by to check in on me, bringing small gifts like homemade bread or fresh eggs from her family's farm. We quickly became friends, and I spent more and more time at her house, chatting with her and her parents. They were warm, welcoming people, always eager to offer help with anything I needed. But as the weeks went by, I started noticing strange things about the town, things that didn't sit right with me. It was the week before the Harvest Festival when I first heard the whispers. At first, they were faint, like a breeze rustling through the trees, but gradually they became clearer. People in the town spoke in hushed tones, their voices lower than usual, their faces drawn with concern. I overheard one of the elderly men talking to Olivia's father about the ritual and how it had to be perfect this year. The way they said it, quiet, almost reverent, made my stomach turn. That night, as I lay in bed, I heard a knock on my door. I opened it to find Olivia standing in the hallway, her face pale and eyes wide with fear. She didn't say anything at first, just looked at me with a mix of worry and sorrow. "Olivia? What's going on?" I asked, my voice shaky from the tension that hung in the air. She hesitated, glancing over her shoulder as if afraid someone might be listening. "Jared, there's something you need to know about Carrington Falls. Something that no one talks about." I sat down on the couch, gesturing for her to join me. She did, her hands trembling in her lap. "There's a cult," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "A group of people who worship something ancient, something dark. Every year, during the Harvest Festival, they perform a ritual, a sacrifice. The whole town is involved, whether they realize it or not. And this year they're after someone new." My heart skipped a beat. "A sacrifice? You mean like..." Olivia nodded, her eyes welling up with tears. "Yes, blood, life. They believe that if they sacrifice someone during the Harvest Festival, they can ensure the crops grow bountifully for the year. They believe it's the only way to protect the town and keep the harvests plentiful." I felt a cold chill wash over me. "But why me? Why are they after me?" Olivia's voice cracked. "Because you're an outsider. They need someone like you to make the ritual work. The stranger, the unfamiliar face. Someone who doesn't belong." I didn't know what to think. The rational part of me wanted to laugh it off as a bad joke, but the look in Olivia's eyes told me she wasn't lying. This wasn't some folklore or tall tale. There was something deeply sinister going on in Carrington Falls, and I had stumbled right into it. That night, I stayed awake, tossing and turning, trying to make sense of what Olivia had told me. If what she said was true, there was nowhere to run. The Harvest Festival was only days away, and I was a part of it, whether I wanted to be or not. The next morning, Olivia showed up at my door again. This time, her face was more determined, her expression grim. "Jared, we have to leave. Tonight, before the ritual begins." I wasn't sure what to say. The thought of leaving Carrington Falls was tempting, but where would we go? Would it even be safe to run? I had no answers, just questions that seemed to lead to more terrifying possibilities. "I can't just leave," I said, my voice shaking. "What about your family? What about everything you know?" Olivia's face darkened. "They're a part of it too. They don't know it, but they are. The whole town is involved. There's no escaping it. We have to stop it, Jared. We have to stop them before it's too late." I stared at her, fear creeping up my spine. How do we stop it? How do we fight something like this? She took a deep breath, then looked me in the eye. "We can't fight them with force. We have to stop the ritual. If we can find the place where they're performing it, we can break it before they complete it. But we have to do it quickly." That night, we snuck out of our houses, avoiding the watchful eyes of the townspeople. Olivia led me through the winding streets, her footsteps light and careful, until we reached the outskirts of the town. The air was thick with tension, and the only sounds were the crunch of gravel beneath our feet and the distant, haunting call of an owl. We arrived at a clearing in the woods, and that's when I saw it. A large, circular stone structure covered in ivy and moss. At first glance, it looked like a forgotten piece of history, abandoned and long since ignored. But as we got closer, I realized that the stones weren't as old as they seemed. They were covered in dark, twisted symbols that seemed to pulse with a life of their own. "This is it," Olivia whispered. "This is where they perform the ritual." I turned to her, my heart racing. "What do we do now?" Olivia looked around nervously. "We wait. We have to make sure we're not seen. Once the ritual begins, there's no turning back." As we hid in the shadows, the full moon rose high in the sky, casting an eerie glow over the clearing. I could hear chanting, low and guttural, coming from the center of the stone circle. My stomach churned as a group of people, draped in dark robes, appeared, their faces hidden by hoods. They formed a tight circle around the altar, their hands raised in unison as they chanted louder. And then, the horror began. A figure emerged from the shadows, bound by ropes and dragged to the center of the circle. It was a woman, someone I didn't recognize. She was pale and trembling, her eyes wide with fear as the robed figures surrounded her. The chanting grew louder, more frantic. One of the figures stepped forward, holding a ceremonial knife in his hand. His face was hidden, but I could see the gleam of excitement in his eyes. I could feel Olivia's hand trembling in mine, her breath shallow and quick. "We have to stop them," she whispered. But there was fear in her voice now, a realization that even she wasn't sure we could stop them. I watched, frozen, as the knife hovered above the woman's chest. The chanting reached a fever pitch, and the figure brought the blade down. Suddenly, there was a bright flash of light, and everything went silent. I don't know how long I stood there, but when I looked up, everything had changed. The clearing was empty, and the stone circle was gone. The woman, the robed figures, the altar, they had all vanished. It was as if the entire scene had been wiped away, as if it had never happened. I turned to Olivia, desperate for answers, but she was gone. There was no trace of her, no sign that she had ever been there. I don't know if it was a dream or some kind of nightmare, but when I woke up the next morning, everything seemed normal again. The town of Carrington Falls was as quiet as ever, and the Harvest Festival was still set to begin that evening. I left the town soon after, never returning to the place where I had once hoped to find peace. The memory of that night haunts me, and I know that somewhere, in the dark corners of the world, the Crimson Circle still waits, performing their rituals, harvesting the lives of those who don't belong. And every year, as the Harvest Festival approaches, I can't help but wonder, who will be the next sacrifice? I don't know when it all started, but looking back now, I wish I had never stepped foot in that town. My name is Thomas, and I never believed in superstitions or ancient rituals, until I found myself entangled in something I couldn't explain, something that haunts me every night. It was supposed to be a normal summer break for me. I had just finished high school and was looking forward to spending the next few months traveling and relaxing. That was before my cousin, Luke, invited me to spend the summer in his small town of Fairbrook. He said it was peaceful, quiet, and a perfect escape from everything. He was right about the peace and quiet, but he didn't warn me about the darkness hiding beneath it all. I arrived in Fairbrook late on a Friday evening, the sun already dipping low in the sky. The drive had taken longer than I expected, and by the time I pulled into Luke's driveway, it was already dark. Luke greeted me with a wide grin and a handshake. He was always the more outgoing one in the family, so I wasn't surprised at how enthusiastic he was. "Glad you made it, man," Luke said, his voice upbeat. "You're gonna love it here. Small town, nothing fancy, but it's got its charm." We headed inside the modest house, and Luke gave me a quick tour. It was comfortable, filled with old furniture and warm colors that made it feel homey. The kitchen smelled of something cooking, probably the dinner his mom was preparing, but I didn't think much of it. I was tired from the long drive and just wanted to relax. Over dinner, Luke's parents, Sandra and Greg, were friendly enough. They were older than my parents, probably in their mid-40s, but they seemed nice. The conversation revolved around how great the town was, how beautiful the scenery was in the summer, and how peaceful everything was. But as the night wore on, I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. That night, after dinner, I decided to take a walk around the neighborhood to stretch my legs. It was the perfect night for a walk. The air was cool, the stars were bright, and the streets were quiet. As I strolled down the road, I noticed the houses were spaced out, each one a little too far apart for my liking. It wasn't a bustling neighborhood, more like a collection of isolated homes, each with its own yard and a sense of separation. I walked for about 20 minutes before I noticed something odd. In the distance, at the edge of the town, there was a large old church with a tall spire, almost out of place against the backdrop of the quiet homes. I hadn't seen it earlier when I arrived, and I wondered how I had missed it. The church itself was made of gray stone, its tall windows dark and empty, like eyes watching the town from afar. Curious, I decided to approach it. There was a gravel path leading up to the church, and as I walked closer, I noticed that the air grew heavier and colder. It was a strange contrast to the warm night air I had been walking in moments before. As I approached the door, I saw a sign that read Fairbrook Assembly in faded gold letters. I had no reason to believe anything was unusual, but there was an unease building in my stomach. The church was quiet, but there were lights flickering in the windows, and I could hear faint murmurs from within. They sounded like chanting. I stepped back, deciding it was best not to get too involved. But as I turned to leave, something caught my eye. A figure standing at the edge of the church grounds, watching me. It was a man, tall and thin, dressed in a long white cloak, his face hidden beneath a hood. He didn't move, just stood there staring at me. I quickly turned away and started walking back toward Luke's house. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up, and I felt like I was being followed. I glanced over my shoulder, but the man in the white cloak was gone. The next morning, I tried to shake off the feeling of unease I had from the previous night. I didn't want to worry Luke, so I kept my concerns to myself. But I noticed something strange during breakfast. Luke's parents seemed a little too eager to talk about the town's traditions and customs. They spoke about the annual gathering that would take place in the woods outside of town. They didn't go into much detail, but the way they said it, the tone in their voices, made it clear that it was an important event. "You'll be joining us, won't you, Thomas?" Greg asked, his eyes sparkling with excitement. "It's a tradition. The gathering is something everyone looks forward to." I nodded, not wanting to seem rude. "Sure, I'd love to. What is it, exactly?" Sandra smiled warmly, but there was a hint of hesitation in her eyes. "It's a community thing," she said softly, "a way for the town to come together. Nothing to worry about, just a few customs and celebrations." Later that day, Luke invited me to the woods where the gathering was going to take place. I wasn't sure what to expect, but I followed him along a narrow trail that led deep into the trees. As we walked, I noticed more and more people gathering around the clearing. They were all wearing white cloaks, and as we got closer, I could see their faces, pale, expressionless, like masks of perfection. There was something deeply unsettling about their eyes. They seemed to lack emotion, as though their souls had been stripped away. They all stood in a perfect circle, forming an eerie and unnatural shape. I tried to make sense of it, but my stomach twisted with dread. Luke, completely unfazed, turned to me with a grin. "This is it. Just go with it, man. It's all part of the experience." We stepped into the circle, and almost immediately, the air grew colder. The people around us began chanting, their voices rising in unison, their words incomprehensible. It was a haunting sound, filled with something ancient and sinister. The man in the white cloak from the night before appeared again. He stepped into the center of the circle, his face still hidden beneath the hood. He raised his arms, and the chanting grew louder. The others around us moved in sync, their eyes fixed on the figure, as if they were waiting for something. I felt a wave of panic flood through me. This wasn't just a gathering, it was a ritual. As the chanting reached a crescendo, the man in the cloak stepped forward and raised his hand. The crowd fell silent. He turned to me, his hooded face finally meeting mine. and I felt a cold chill run through my bones. "You've come to us," he said, his voice deep and smooth. "You've been chosen." I didn't know what to say, my throat dry, my heart pounding in my chest. "Chosen for what?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. He smiled, a cold, knowing smile. "To be the sacrifice." It was only then that I understood the truth about the gathering. The people of Fairbrook were not simply part of some harmless tradition. They were part of a cult that had been practicing rituals for generations. Each year, they selected an outsider, someone like me, and offered them as a sacrifice to some dark force they worshipped. In exchange, the town's crops flourished, their livestock thrived, and the town remained untouched by misfortune. The man in the white cloak stepped forward and reached for me, his hand cold as ice. My instincts kicked in, and I bolted. I pushed through the crowd, hearing their chanting behind me as I ran. I didn't stop until I reached the edge of town. My heart was pounding, and I was gasping for breath. I could feel the eyes of the townspeople on me, watching from the shadows, but I didn't dare look back. When I finally made it back to Luke's house, I told him everything. He didn't deny it. Instead, he looked at me with an expression I'll never forget. Sadness, regret, and something darker, something that hinted at the terrible truth. "I'm sorry, Thomas," he said, his voice filled with regret. "I didn't want you to find out, but it's too late now. They'll come for you." And they did. That night, I tried to leave Fairbrook. I packed my bags and drove as fast as I could, but the roads twisted and turned in ways that felt unnatural. I felt like I was driving in circles, no matter which direction I took. And then, in the distance, I saw it again, the church, the tall spire, the man in the white cloak standing at the door. I turned back. To this day, I don't know how I escaped. All I know is that Fairbrook is still there, waiting, lurking in the shadows. And every night, as I try to sleep, I hear the whisper of chanting on the wind. I know they'll come for me again, just as they've come for others before me. The town of Fairbrook is cursed, and once you're chosen, there's no escaping the harvest. It was a crisp autumn night when I first arrived in Harrowbrook, a small town nestled deep in the hills of the Appalachians. The kind of town you drive through and never think twice about. The kind of town where time seemed to stand still, where the houses were old, the streets winding, and the people even older. I was just passing through, looking for a place to rest for the night. But Harrowbrook had other plans for me. My name is Thomas, and this is the story of how I found myself tangled in something dark, something ancient, something I never should have seen. The town of Harrowbrook was not on any map I could find. I had been driving for hours, and it wasn't until the gas light came on that I realized I hadn't seen another car for miles. My GPS was useless, constantly losing signal as I wound my way through the thick forest. I decided to pull into the first town I could find. Harrowbrook appeared out of nowhere, as if the town had been hidden from the world. The sign at the entrance said, "Welcome to Harrowbrook," in faded letters, surrounded by a thick mist that seemed to hover just above the ground. I pulled into a small gas station at the edge of town, the only sign of life for miles. The station had an old, worn-out feel, with a flickering fluorescent light above the door. I parked, got out of the car, and walked inside. The place smelled of stale coffee and something else, something earthy, almost like the smell of wet soil. Behind the counter stood an elderly man with thick glasses and a gruff demeanor. He barely looked up when I entered, but his eyes followed me as I approached the counter. "You need gas?" he asked, his voice rough and low. "Actually, I was just looking for a place to stay for the night," I replied. "I'm just passing through." He grunted, his eyes narrowing as if sizing me up. "You're not from around here, are you?" "No, I'm not," I said, feeling a little uncomfortable under his gaze. He paused, as if considering something. "You can stay at the inn down the road. You'll be fine there," he said, almost too quickly. I didn't think much of it at the time, but looking back, I realized that his words were strange. It felt like he was warning me, trying to steer me away from asking too many questions. I thanked him and left the gas station, heading towards the inn. The inn was a small, two-story building with peeling paint and an overgrown garden in front. A faded sign above the door read, "Harrowbrook Inn." It looked as though it hadn't been renovated in decades. I hesitated before going inside, but the thought of a warm bed for the night was too appealing. I stepped through the creaky door and into the dimly lit lobby. The air inside was musty, with an odd, pungent smell that reminded me of mold and old wood. The woman behind the counter was elderly, with short gray hair and sharp features. She didn't greet me, but she looked up as I approached. "I need a room for the night," I said. She nodded, her eyes flicking briefly to the door before she handed me a key. "Room 7, upstairs." I thanked her and made my way up the narrow staircase. The walls of the inn creaked and groaned as I walked, the floorboards feeling soft beneath my feet. I reached the door to room 7, unlocked it, and stepped inside. The room was small and sparse, with a single bed, a worn-out armchair in the corner, and a window that looked out over the foggy street. There was something unsettling about the place, but I was too tired to care. I locked the door behind me, dropped my bags on the floor, and lay down on the bed. The soft rustling of the leaves outside the window was the last thing I remembered before falling into a restless sleep. I woke up to the sound of faint chanting in the distance. My eyes snapped open, and for a moment, I wasn't sure if I had heard it or if it was a dream. I lay still, straining to hear. The chanting was rhythmic, almost hypnotic, and it seemed to be coming from somewhere nearby. I got out of bed and walked over to the window, trying to get a better sense of where the sound was coming from. The fog had thickened during the night, and the streets were completely empty. I could barely see beyond the edge of the inn's property, but the chanting was louder now, filling the air with an eerie, unsettling energy. I stepped back from the window, my heart beginning to race. There was something wrong about this place. The air felt heavy, oppressive, as if the very walls of the inn were closing in on me. Suddenly, there was a knock at the door. I froze, my mind racing. Who could be knocking at this hour? I opened the door cautiously, and there stood a man in his late 40s, dressed in a dark suit. He had a calm, almost serene expression on his face, but there was something in his eyes, a coldness that made my skin crawl. "You're new to town, aren't you?" he asked, his voice smooth and measured. I nodded, unsure of how to respond. "Yeah, just passing through. Is everything all right?" He smiled, but it was a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Everything's fine. We just wanted to make sure you're comfortable. It's a tradition in Harrowbrook to make sure guests feel welcome." "Tradition?" I asked, my curiosity piqued. "What kind of tradition?" He seemed to hesitate for a moment, then waved a hand dismissively. "Nothing to worry about. Just a small ceremony tonight. You'll be fine." He gave me a knowing look. "Enjoy your stay." Before I could respond, he turned and walked away, disappearing into the mist. I stood there in the doorway, confused and unsettled. What was he talking about? What ceremony? But the more I thought about it, the more I realized I had no intention of sticking around to find out. I decided to leave the inn and find somewhere else to stay, but as I stepped outside, the fog had thickened even more. I couldn't see more than a few feet in front of me. The chanting was louder now, almost deafening, and it seemed to be coming from the woods just beyond the edge of town. The entire town was silent, as if holding its breath, but the rhythmic chanting kept growing, drawing me in like a magnet. I felt a cold shiver run down my spine. Something wasn't right. I turned to head back inside the inn when I saw them. Figures dressed in dark cloaks, moving silently through the fog, their heads bowed. They were gathering at the edge of the street, forming a line, their movements synchronized in a way that was too deliberate, too precise to be normal. I took a step back, my heart pounding in my chest. The chanting grew louder still, and I realized, with growing horror, that it wasn't just some ceremony. It was a ritual that had been happening for years, centuries even, one that was meant to summon something from the depths of the earth, something that the people of Harrowbrook had been feeding for generations. I turned to run, but before I could make it back to the inn, I was grabbed from behind. The man in the suit was there, his grip like iron. "You shouldn't have come here," he whispered, his breath cold against my ear. "It's too late now. The harvest is upon us." I struggled, but his grip only tightened. I looked around, desperate for help, but the streets were empty, the fog swallowing everything in its path. The next thing I remember is waking up in the woods. I had no idea how I had gotten there, but I was surrounded by the figures in the cloaks. They were standing in a circle, chanting in unison. The air was thick with an otherworldly energy, and I could feel the ground beneath me trembling. The man in the suit stood at the center of the circle, his eyes locked onto mine. "The harvest must be completed," he said, his voice low and chilling. "And you are the offering." I tried to scream, but no sound came out. I was paralyzed with fear, unable to move as the chanting reached a crescendo. And then, as if on cue, the earth beneath us split open, revealing a gaping, black void. From it, something ancient and horrible emerged, something that had been waiting for centuries. The last thing I remember before everything went dark was the man in the suit smiling at me, his eyes gleaming with an otherworldly hunger. I don't know how I escaped, but I did. I ran and never looked back. I've told this story to a few people since, but no one believes me. They say it's just a nightmare, a result of stress or exhaustion. But I know the truth. Harrowbrook is real, and the Red Harvest still happens every year. And if you're ever passing through, don't stop. Don't even look at the town, because once you're chosen, there's no escaping the harvest. I've always been the kind of person who loved to explore. As a kid, I would wander the woods behind my house for hours, always coming back with some new discovery. An abandoned treehouse, a hidden stream, or strange symbols carved into the bark of old trees. As I grew older, my fascination with the unknown only deepened. It was this curiosity that eventually led me to the town of Hollowbrook, a place I would later wish I had never heard of. My name is Emma, and I've always been skeptical of ghost stories and urban legends. But Hollowbrook changed everything. I don't know how long it's been since I left, but I still wake up at night, sweating, my heart racing, haunted by the sound of whispers carried on the wind. It all started when I was looking for a quiet weekend getaway. I had heard about Hollowbrook from an old friend who had spent a few years there as a child. It was a small town, she said, located in a secluded part of the countryside. There were rumors of strange happenings, disappearances, odd rituals, but nothing concrete. It sounded like the perfect place for me to get away from the hustle and bustle of my city life. A chance to relax, take a deep breath, and forget about the pressures of work for a while. When I arrived, the first thing I noticed was the silence. It was eerie, the kind of silence that wraps around you and makes you feel like you're the only one alive. The town was small, with just a few old buildings scattered along a main street. The locals were few and far between, but they all had a strange, distant look in their eyes, like they were always waiting for something to happen. I checked into a small, run-down bed and breakfast at the edge of town. The owner, a middle-aged woman named Alice, was kind but odd, her mannerisms a little too polite, as if she were trying to hide something. After a brief exchange, she handed me the key to my room and told me to make myself at home. That evening, I decided to take a walk through the town. It was about 6 p.m., the perfect time to enjoy the crisp autumn air before the sun set. As I wandered down the main street, I noticed a peculiar thing. The houses seemed to be abandoned. Windows were shut tight, and the yards were overgrown with weeds. I passed a few people, but they didn't greet me or even acknowledge my presence. It felt as though they were all moving in their own little worlds, disconnected from everything around them. I turned a corner and found myself in front of a small, weathered church. The building was old, its stone walls cracked and worn by time. But what struck me as most unusual were the symbols carved into the church's wooden door. They were strange, angular shapes, nothing like I had ever seen before. They looked ancient, as though they had been carved into the wood centuries ago. For some reason, I couldn't stop staring at them. It was almost as if the symbols were drawing me in, calling me to come closer. I pulled myself away from the door, shaking off the feeling of unease. As I walked past the church, I noticed a group of people standing in the yard, just inside the fence. They were dressed in long, dark robes, their faces hidden beneath hoods. They were murmuring softly, as though they were chanting, but I couldn't make out the words. I quickened my pace, not wanting to draw attention to myself. The last thing I needed was to get involved with whatever strange ritual they were performing. The following day, I met a local named Ben at the bed and breakfast. He was in his late 20s, with shaggy brown hair and a nervous smile. We struck up a conversation over breakfast, and as I asked him about the town, I noticed that his eyes kept darting toward the window, like he was afraid someone might be watching. "Is there something wrong with this place?" I asked, genuinely curious. I had already gotten a strange feeling from the town, but I wanted to hear it from someone who had lived there. Ben hesitated, his hands shaking slightly as he picked up his coffee cup. "It's not like other places," he said, lowering his voice. "There's something wrong with Hollowbrook. Some people don't leave, others disappear, and some of us are chosen." I raised an eyebrow, unsure whether he was being serious or just joking. But Ben's face was deadly serious. "What do you mean, chosen?" I asked. Ben leaned in, his voice barely above a whisper. "The Hollow One," he said, his eyes darting nervously around the room. "You've heard the stories, right? About the Hollow One." I nodded, though I hadn't heard anything about it before. He sighed, his expression turning dark. "They say that every few years, the town, well, it offers up a sacrifice. Someone who hasn't been here long, someone who's just passing through. And when they do, the Hollow One comes. It's an old ritual, one that's been done for centuries. No one knows who or what the Hollow One really is. But people say it's something from the woods. Something that comes when the sacrifice is made." I stared at him, trying to process what he was saying. "Wait, so you're telling me that people in this town, they sacrifice someone to this Hollow One?" Ben looked around again, as though to make sure no one was listening. "I'm not saying it's real," he said, his voice shaking. "But I'm telling you, some things around here are different. People act strange when the time comes, and it's like the whole town is part of it. I've seen it happen. I didn't know what to think. I had come to Hollowbrook to escape the stresses of my life, not to stumble into some weird conspiracy." But Ben's fear was palpable, and I could see that he wasn't lying. Later that night, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me. The quiet of the town was suffocating, and every time I looked out the window, it seemed like the shadows were growing longer, darker. I decided to take a walk, hoping the fresh air would calm my nerves. As I walked down the street, I passed the church again. This time, the door was slightly ajar, and the murmurs of chanting drifted out from inside. I hesitated for a moment, the pull of curiosity far stronger than my fear. Something told me I needed to see what was going on. I stepped inside, careful not to make a sound. The church was dimly lit by candles placed on every surface. The air was thick with incense, and the chanting was louder now, more intense. The robed figures were gathered in a circle, their hands raised in unison as if they were beckoning something. In the center of the circle stood a large, wooden statue, a figure of a man, but its face was hollow, like a mask with no features, and its body was adorned with strange carvings. The figure looked wrong, unnatural, as if it didn't belong in the world. Suddenly, a cold wind swept through the church, extinguishing the candles and causing the figures to falter in their chant. I could hear them whispering now, but their words were jumbled, like a language I couldn't understand. A low growl echoed from the woods outside, and the air seemed to grow heavier. I tried to leave, but my legs wouldn't move. It was as though something was holding me in place, keeping me trapped in the church. I could feel it, the presence of something ancient, something powerful, looming just beyond my reach. That's when I saw it. A figure emerged from the darkness at the edge of the room. It was tall, towering over the robed figures. Its face was hidden beneath a hood, but I could feel its eyes on me, as if it knew I was there. The Hollow One. It stepped forward, and I felt a jolt of fear shoot through my chest. I wanted to scream, but no sound came out. The robed figures fell to their knees in reverence, bowing their heads. "You shouldn't have come here," a voice said, and it wasn't from the Hollow One. It was Ben, standing at the back of the room. His face was pale, his eyes wide with terror. The Hollow One extended a hand, and everything went black. I woke up in my bed at the bed and breakfast. It was morning, but everything felt wrong. I rushed to the window and looked out. The streets were empty. The church was gone. I didn't stay in Hollowbrook another minute. I grabbed my things and left without looking back. To this day, I don't know what happened in that church, but I know one thing for sure. Hollowbrook is a place best left forgotten. If you ever find yourself near the hills, don't make the mistake I did. Don't look for Hollowbrook, because once you see the hollow one, it's too late to run. I'll never forget the night I stumbled upon something that I wasn't supposed to see. I wasn't supposed to know, but somehow, my curiosity led me to a place I wish I had never found. My name is Sean, and this is the story of how I came face to face with a cult. One that had been hiding in plain sight for generations, and how they almost took me with them. I was just out of college when I decided to take a break from city life. I'd been stressed, burned out, and in need of some peace and quiet. I rented a small cabin in the mountains of the Pacific Northwest, near a town called Whitestone. Whitestone was a quiet, picturesque place, tucked away from the world. It seemed like the perfect escape. The cabin I rented was small but cozy, with a fireplace and large windows that offered a breathtaking view of the dense forest. There were few people in town, and most of them kept to themselves. At first, I thought it was just a normal, sleepy little mountain town, but I was wrong. The first few days were peaceful. I spent my time hiking, reading, and just enjoying the solitude. It wasn't until I made the mistake of venturing into town to buy some supplies that things began to change. The town was just a few miles away from the cabin. It was smaller than I expected, with a population of barely 100. There was a small market, a diner, and a gas station, but little else. The people who lived there were quiet and reserved, but they were polite enough. As I walked around the market, I noticed that everyone seemed to know each other. They exchanged small talk, smiled at one another, but their eyes never quite met. It was like they were all holding something back, a secret they weren't willing to share. I noticed an old man sitting at the counter of the diner. He had a long, gray beard, and he wore a thick, weathered coat. He looked out of place, like he had been there for far too long. His eyes followed me as I walked in, and he gave me a nod, which I returned hesitantly. I didn't think much of it, but when I sat down to order coffee, I overheard part of a conversation that caught my attention. "Something big this year," the old man muttered to the waitress. "The time is near." I couldn't hear the rest of the conversation, but I couldn't shake the feeling that there was something odd about it. I tried to focus on my coffee, but my curiosity got the better of me. I paid for my coffee and decided to leave the diner, but as I passed the old man's table, he looked up at me and caught my eye. "You're new to Whitestone, aren't you?" he asked. I nodded. "Just passing through. Needed a break." His gaze lingered for a moment, then he looked around before leaning in closer. "Be careful. There are things in these woods that you don't want to find." I felt a chill run down my spine. His voice was low, almost conspiratorial, and his eyes were filled with something dark. But before I could ask him what he meant, he turned his head away, as if the conversation was over. That night, I couldn't stop thinking about what the old man had said. Things in the woods. What did he mean? Was it just a warning to keep me out of trouble? Or was there something deeper to it? I decided to ignore my growing unease and go for a late-night walk through the forest. The moon was full, and the air was cool and crisp. It felt good to be outside, breathing in the fresh mountain air. As I walked deeper into the woods, I began to notice strange markings on the trees. Symbols carved into the bark, patterns that seemed to repeat themselves. At first, I thought it was just random, but as I looked closer, I realized that the symbols were deliberate, and they seemed to be guiding me further into the forest. My curiosity got the better of me, and I followed the trail of markings, wondering where they led. After what felt like an hour of walking, I came upon a clearing. At the center of the clearing was an old stone structure, half covered by moss and vines. It looked ancient, like something from another time. I could hear the faint sound of chanting in the distance, and I froze. It was coming from the direction of the structure. I stepped closer, careful not to make a sound. As I approached, I could make out figures in the shadows, moving in a circle. They were dressed in dark robes, their faces hidden beneath hoods. There were at least 20 of them, maybe more. I couldn't tell exactly what they were doing, but I could see that they were performing some kind of ritual. The air was thick with an energy that I couldn't explain, something heavy and oppressive. Then, one of the figures raised their arms, and the chanting grew louder, almost deafening. I could feel the ground beneath my feet tremble, and a cold wind swept through the trees. I wanted to run, to escape, but I couldn't move. I was rooted to the spot, my body frozen in place. I don't know how long I stood there, watching, but when I finally mustered the courage to turn around and leave, I stepped on a twig, causing a loud crack. The chanting stopped immediately. My heart raced as I felt every set of eyes turn toward me. The figures began to move toward me, their faces still hidden beneath their hoods. I didn't wait to see what they wanted. I ran. I barely made it back to the cabin that night. My legs were shaking, and I couldn't get the images of the ritual out of my mind. The symbols, the chanting, the feeling of being watched. It all felt like a nightmare I couldn't wake up from. The next day, I tried to push the events of the previous night out of my mind. I didn't want to believe what I had seen, but deep down, I knew something wasn't right in Whitestone. I returned to the diner that afternoon to get some food. As soon as I walked in, the waitress, a young woman with a tired face, greeted me with a forced smile. "Back again," she said, but there was a nervousness in her voice. I nodded and sat down at the counter. The old man was there again, sipping his coffee. He glanced at me but didn't say anything. I hesitated for a moment before speaking. "I saw something last night," I said, my voice low. "A group of people in the woods. They were doing some kind of ritual." The old man's eyes locked onto mine. For a moment, he didn't speak, and I thought maybe he hadn't heard me. Then, in a voice so quiet that I could barely hear him, he said, "You shouldn't have seen that. You've been marked now." His words hit me like a punch to the gut. I stared at him, unable to speak. "They've been waiting," he continued, his voice growing colder. "They've been waiting for someone like you. Someone who will listen, someone who will see." The waitress came over, her face pale. "Don't listen to him," she whispered. "Please, just go. Leave while you still can." I was about to ask her what she meant when the door to the diner opened. In walked a tall man dressed in a dark coat. He had a stern look on his face, and when he saw me, his expression darkened. "You've been asking questions," he said, his voice sharp. "It's too late for that now." I didn't know what he meant, but I didn't want to stick around to find out. Without another word, I left the diner, my heart pounding in my chest. That night, I packed my things and left the cabin. I drove as fast as I could, not looking back. The road was dark, the headlights illuminating nothing but trees and mist. But as I drove, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was following me. Every time I glanced in the rearview mirror, I thought I saw shadows moving in the trees. The road stretched on for miles, but it felt like the town was still there, waiting. To this day, I don't know what would have happened if I had stayed. Maybe I would have been part of their ritual. Maybe I would have disappeared like so many before me. All I know is that the town of Whitestone is not a place you visit out of curiosity. It's a place that chooses its own. And once you've seen what they're capable of, there's no escaping the darkness they've been hiding for centuries. So if you ever find yourself on the outskirts of a small, quiet town, and the locals seem a little too quiet, a little too guarded, turn around. Don't stop. Because once you become part of their story, it's already too late.